Hey everybody, happy Tuesday and welcome to another Techstrong TV broadcast. Today is Tuesday, February 8th. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon and I'm very excited about today's show. We've got a lot of really great conversations on tap for you. We get things kicked off today with a conversation between Alan and John Egan, who is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Catawba. John is talking to Alan about IRConf, which is the first conference that is fully dedicated to incident response. Catawba is actually hosting the conference, and they have a modern incident management platform. And so they talk about what the conference is about and how the technology kind of fits into the whole discussion. After that, Alan speaks with Brian Behlendorf, who is the general manager of the Open Ssf. And Open Ssf just launched the Alpha Omega project that will improve the security posture of open source software through direct engagement of software security experts and automated security testing. So Brian and Alan talk about this new project, Alpha Omega project, and how Microsoft and Google are actually supporting the Alpha Omega project with an initial investment of $5 million. So they talk about what that means for the project as well. So it's a great conversation. After that, we have Part 2 of our Haunted Hacker podcast. This one is the continuation of a conversation that host Mike Jones has with Dr. Gerald Auger, who was the chief content creator at Simply Cyber and managing partner at Coastal Information Security Group. They talk about 2021, what happened in 21 from a cybersecurity perspective, and offer up some of their predictions for 2022. It's a great conversation, as always. After that, we have another in our DevOps Unbound series. This is the latest installment. This one features Kristen Webb from Tricentis, Donald Lutz from Taos, and Andreas Grabner from Dynatrace, speaking along with Mitch Ashley and Alan to discuss the key benefits of performance testing in the cloud and what organizations should consider to be the what to consider when building, a cloud performance testing strategy. This is a really fascinating conversation because I don't think a lot of organizations talk enough about performance testing, or there's all kinds of testing that goes on, but performance testing specifically hasn't really been kind of top of conversation for a lot of organizations. So hopefully this will kind of put it higher on the radar. It's a great conversation with lots of takeaways, so definitely want to check that one out. All right, after that, we've got our Something Old segment. And this is from the recent last year's RSAC DevOps Connect 2021 virtual event. This one features Nisha Kumar, who is a member of the technical staff at VMware, and Alan Friedman, who's the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives and TIA at the Department of Commerce. They have a presentation titled, What Are Clouds Made Of? SBOM and Code Transparency in Modern Applications. So they talk about, they give an overview of emerging expectations in software that we should be able to track what libraries and dependencies an organization uses. So they discuss the importance of a software bill of materials in their conversation and offer an overview of the concept and their hierarchical relationships, easy for me to say. This is a great presentation, and considering the amount of cybersecurity issues that have happened, especially with respect to the cloud over the last 2 years, the idea of a software bill of materials is certainly growing in popularity. So definitely a relevant conversation. You want to check this one out as well. After that, I am back with the news headlines, and then I have a great conversation with Lisa Plagemeyer, who is the new executive director at the National Cybersecurity Alliance. We talk about some of the biggest trends in cybersecurity. Lisa and I spoke actually during Data Privacy Week, so there were a lot of really interesting topics on the table for our discussion. Just suffice to say, we've got a lot to unpack in our conversation, so please give this one a look. And And as an aside, later on this week, we are going to have another installment of Techstrong Women, and Lisa is our guest on that as well, and I'm very excited to have that conversation with her as well. So please do check that out on Thursday. But back to today. After my conversation with Lisa, I have the webinar's preview for you, and then we close things out with the View with Vizard. In this one, Mike Vizard is speaking with GearSet CEO Kevin Boyle, and they discuss how low-code Salesforce platforms are going to expand the DevOps community in 2022. Certainly another relevant and fascinating conversation. All right, that is today's lineup, and it is a good one, folks. And we're going to get things kicked off right after these commercial messages. All right, we are back, kicking off today's Techstrong TV broadcast. We have a conversation between Alan and John Egan, who was the CEO and co-founder of Catawba. They're going to discuss the IR-Conf, which is the first fully dedicated incident response conference, and it is actually being sponsored by Catawba. They're the ones who are actually putting it on. And they have a modern incident management platform, so it makes perfect sense for the organization to have to be hosting IR-Conf. So it is a great conversation about a great topic and a great conference to come. So let's go ahead and roll it now.
This is Digital Anarchist. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Techstrong TV, and we've got another segment for you here. I'm happy to be joined by John Egan. John is CEO of Catawba Incident Response. Hey, John, welcome to Techstrong TV.
Thanks, Alan. Good to be here.
Nice to have you. So, John, I might have messed up. What your position with Catawba is?
That's right, CEO and co-founder.
Okay, and you know what? I mean, I've heard of Catawba, but that doesn't mean our audience knows Catawba. So if you wouldn't mind, give us maybe a quick little background on Catawba and maybe a little bit of your own background.
Yeah, so Catawba is an incident response platform. We're designed to let any organization be able to easily implement best practices for responding to critical moments within the company. So this tends to be things like site outages, major customer issues, and other sort of technical and non-technical problems that require kind of a group real-time response. Separate from like project management where you might have planned things that are happening. You take like the outage that happened, I think yesterday at GitLab is a good example, right? Or a Slack outage like that. That has an incident response team that's responding to that situation and making sure it gets fixed quickly. And they're probably using some kind of tool, either internally or off the shelf. And we're that tool that any organization can implement in minutes instead of bringing in a consultant and spending months on this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And you know what was interesting, John, is, I mean, look, I've seen, for whatever reason, since I started DevOps.com 8 years ago, incident response has always been like this, as part of the DevOps story. And we've seen, of course, several companies have very successful exits and be, very successful. And they all kind of follow this pattern where they were replacing the beeper, and then they became incident response. And then it becomes a whole platform and APIs and integrations and so forth. What makes Catawba different?
So we're really purists on the incident response side of things. I think a lot of organizations that come into this space end up either kind of pivoting over towards alerting, right, which is sort of PagerDuty's world, which is more about automated detection, ping someone, it gets closed out. You might get thousands of these things across the organization, or they go broad and start to become, more of like an SRE platform to try to handle all of these different things that the site reliability engineers are really managing inside of the organization. But we really believe that incident response stands on its own as a practice that cuts across all of the organizations inside of your company. So something unique about Catawba is normally when you're rolling it out within the organization, you might start small. You might start with 5 or 6 seats, a couple of people in SRE, but really rapidly, we tend to get deployed across the entire organization. And what we do really well is we're a collaborative layer that helps everyone from customer success to your SREs to even your PR and marketing guys all be connected during these critical moments. And all have one place that they can go to see what's happening and participate in that response. And it's a bit more of, we call it an evolved sense of incident response, right? Versus kind of the old-fashioned way of looking at it, which might be 2 or 3 people in your SRE team are responsible for this. It's really more about the entire community of your organization that responds to these company critical moments and building software that makes it easy for all of those people to participate. So we're a very non-technical feeling piece of software. We're very human-driven. Everything from our reporting to our collaboration experience to the way you go and write documents, which is a new feature we've just released. All of this information is designed to be as easy to use as something like Google, as opposed to being, more like a, like almost like a ServiceNow kind of like complex enterprise implementation.
Got it. Good stuff. And John, well, we're going to talk about this conference you guys are putting on, but before we dive into that, so we understand what Catawba is. In your go-to-market here, what are you guys finding? What are you seeing? What's kind of the state of the market, if you will?
So we're really learning a lot about this community as it's just starting to form, right? And I think when communities are young and they're new, you actually find that best practices are pretty fluid. And I think it's one of the unique things about this space is Google put out a book back in 2016 where they sort of defined how they handle incident response internally. And it was the first time anyone really wrote it down, in a way that could be absorbed. But it turns out every organization has a slightly different attitude that they take towards this space. And when you're implementing a product, something like Catawba, it really turns out that that product has to be pretty flexible on its way in to make sure that it's easy for people to adopt. And then it also has to bring with it sort of almost like a light hand to say, and these are the very high level macro steps you're going to take to be successful, right? And so what we learned early on is when Catawba first launched, over a year ago, we were very rigid about the way that you sort of had to come in and step through, each part of incident response. And what we've really learned and what the product's evolved towards is to have rigidity around the high level steps, report, openness around visibility to when incidents are happening, like easy to use collaborative spaces, postmortems that are editable and changeable, but also be flexible in terms of who's getting access to this thing. How are you giving people titles that are non-technical in the customer success roles, and in the marketing and PR roles? And how do you bring all of that together at once? And we thought when we came in that, okay, maybe this would be a couple of seat experience for people. You come in and maybe you need 2 or 3 seats, grow to 4 or 5. And what we've really learned is these are company practices, like I was saying before. And I think that's been kind of our big learning about the space is as the community grows, this is really a cross-functional community inside of organizations rather than just a technical practice inside of DevOps. And I think that's really exciting.
Absolutely. Absolutely so. John, you guys are coming in or behind the first dedicated incident response virtual conference coming up in April. Why don't you, well, I already said it, I guess, but why don't you take it from there? Tell us more.
Yeah, so IRConf, or Incident Response Conference, was really built out of the fact that we just couldn't find another one to be part of that was focusing purely on the incident responder. And when we talk about communities internally, you think of communities as what makes people put their hands up and say, I'm part of that, right? And I think, DevOps and SRE and a lot of these spaces have done a good job, right? We have crowds and people will say, okay, I'm part of that. Incident response has always been one of those ones where I think people have sort of nervously said, well, I think I'm part of that. And what IRConf really does is it focuses not on sort of that statement of I'm in the incident response department, but instead focuses on the idea that I'm a responder, right? I've been part of responding to a major incident. And when you ask that question, it turns out a lot of hands go up, and it turns out that there's a community there that's really looking for other practitioners to come together and talk about these things I was just talking about, right? Best practices, right? What are other companies experiencing? How are we defining this role and the people who are involved? And so what's really cool about this conference is we get to focus really directly on that incident response process, not even necessarily as it relates to other parts of DevOps, but just how we deal with this very specific problem that faces all organizations. So I'm really excited. We have one of our keynote is Emily Freeman, who's out of AWS and has done all kinds of great talks about kind of the wider software development lifecycle inside of DevOps. And here she can speak much more directly, to this incident response space. And I think you can see the excitement around it. We have sponsors, basically everyone across the DevOps world: Honeycomb, Commodore, Rookout, Bridgecrew, Gremlin, LaunchDarkly, LogTNA, Teleport. All of these folks, really came running in and said, yes, this is great. We need a space to come in and talk to our sub-communities that are already using our products that care about this space. And so really, we just felt like there was a hole in the market. And so this is a free conference. Anyone can join. This is a virtual conference. It's on April 1st. It's at irconf.io if you're out there looking for it. And we're really hoping to just get everyone to come along who's ever been involved in an incident before and has experienced that fire moment inside of a company of, hopefully not panic, but maybe panic, and wants to come together and talk to other folks who have had the same experience.
Sure. I'm thrown back to my cyber, we didn't call it cyber then, to my InfoSec days in the war room, and when stuff hit the fan. Best practices that were to set up a war room on how to respond to a breach or, some sort of attack.
And that's really where a lot of this grew out of, right? The history of incident response really lived in the security world. And it's one of these parts of the evolution of the space, right? That now we're adopting, that process that really got its feet inside of the security incident response space across the organization, to say, wow, these guys are doing a great job. Like, we should be doing similar work across the org.
Not all companies had such a great job on their war room, but that's a whole nother story. Hey, John, you mentioned Emily Freeman speaking. Who are some of the other speakers?
Yep. So we've got two who are announced right now, and it's Emily Freeman and it's Dave Renzen. Dave Renzen was previously at Google and ran a good chunk of the SRE team there. He's at a new organization now, and he's spoken at a couple of other conferences in the DevOps space, specifically about the process of incident response. So I'm really excited about him being able to come in as well and talk both from a large company standpoint, right, at a company like Google, where he really pushed a lot of customer metrics, right, for dealing with incidents, not just internal technical metrics, as well as the smaller company, like where he's moved to now as a startup. So those two are kind of our cornerstones. Then we've got a series of other speakers who we're announcing over the next couple of weeks, who are coming in from all over industry. So I'm really excited. I can't announce them here yet. They're not finalized.
Okay, good.
Really exciting, great.
Can't blame me for asking. All right.
Hey, John, for people who are interested, what that was irconf.io?
That's right, irconf.io. Come in there and just click attend and register. We're still early bird, so everything's free right now.
Yep, and it's April 1st. Do you have times on that?
I believe we're planning to start it early. It's around 8:30 is the beginning of it.
East Coast time.
Technically a half day, but it runs till about 2, I believe.
So that's East Coast time, though?
East Coast time, yes.
Yep.
We've got a global audience here, so that's East Coast U.S. time. John, sounds great, and if there's a need in the market, the market pours a vacuum. So it's good to see it getting filled here. I want to wish you the best with it, with the conference, and with Catawba.
Great. Thanks, Alan.
Great having you. John Egan, CEO, co-founder Catawba, the folks behind IRConf, and you can find out more about that at irconf.io. That's coming April 1st. Check it out. We're going to take a break here on Techstrong TV, and we'll be right back.
SecurityBoulevard.com is the leading resource for news, analysis, and education on challenges facing the cybersecurity industry. SecurityBoulevard.com covers all aspects of cybersecurity, including data security, DevSecOps, cloud security, application security, network security, security threats, and more. SecurityBoulevard.com has the largest selection of security content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.securityboulevard.com to learn more. SecurityBoulevard.com, home of Security Bloggers Network.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Next up, Alan speaks with Brian Behlendorf, who is the general manager of Open Ssf. Open Ssf recently announced the Alpha Omega project, which aims to improve the security posture of open source software through direct engagement of software security experts and automated security testing. This is a really fascinating technology, a really fascinating project. Google and Microsoft are both supporting the Alpha Omega project with an initial investment of $5 million. So Alan and Brian talk about what the Alpha Omega project hopes to achieve, and Open Ssf as the host of that project, and really about open source software security as well. So let's go ahead and roll the conversation.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, welcome to another segment for Techstrong TV. My guest today is Brian Behlendorf. Brian is with the Open Source Security Foundation. That's the OSSF. The Open Source Security Foundation, of course, is part of the Linux Foundation, and it's a relatively new organization. I think it was announced. Was it announced at QCon, CNCFCon back in, I guess, September? Was that, Brian?
We announced kind of the second generation of the project in October. The project's been around for about a year longer than that, actually just over that, as a collaboration between some things that Microsoft had started and Google had started. The Linux Foundation said, let's put this in the same pot, and a tremendous community of volunteers stepped up to do all sorts of things and get plates spinning on top of poles, and then around about October, we realized, hey, there's some places where spending some money would be helpful, and here's a whole bunch of companies willing to come in as sponsors and really fund some of that work. And so that also freed me up to be able to focus full time on it as well.
Absolutely. And we're going to get into some of what those companies are and what you're doing in a moment. But I really kind of short-armed you on my introduction because we jumped right into Open Ssf. Brian, why don't you tell people what's your position with the Open Ssf and maybe a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm general manager for Open Ssf. At the Linux Foundation, we're a whole bunch of these different kinds of projects. And typically, we pull together a small staff around some of the major ones, like the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, like Hyperledger, like the automotive grade Linux. I mean, so many here. And so my role is to help kind of make sure that the community is developing things within the scope of what its charter is, that we're making sure everybody who shows up to help, to volunteer, to with an idea, with something they want to do, has a place to land that and be supported in that, and then connected to the set of sponsors that are providing the funding to be able to go and not only have a staff to help build the community, but also get the word out about what we're doing. Also put together projects like some of the ones that we've announced recently, like Alpha Omega, another one called SigStore, and provide some resources to help those projects really take off.
Excellent. All right. And Brian, before your position with Open Ssf, what kind of was your, what's your background?
So I've been with the Linux Foundation for just about 6 years now. I joined in 2016 to perform the same kind of role for another initiative called Hyperledger, which is in the blockchain technology space, kind of at the other end of the spectrum from all the cryptocurrency and NFT kind of craziness. But that's been a great run. That project is still thriving and I passed the baton on that successfully. Before that, I've done a number of different things. I was Chief Technology Officer for the World Economic Forum for a few years. I worked in the Obama administration in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I started a couple of companies. I was an early employee at Wired Magazine. I co-founded the Apache Software Foundation, and I've been on the boards of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Mozilla Foundation for over 10 years.
That's great. Some impressive wins there and impressive experiences. What a great person, what a great asset for the Linux Foundation. Brian, you know, for some folks in our audience, this may be their very first exposure to OSSF. So maybe we should start with what's the charter, what's the mission of Open Ssf?
Yeah, well, we're really focused on how do we raise the baseline of security across the open source ecosystem, recognizing that open source is embedded entirely inside of very widely inside of even proprietarily licensed software out there, cloud services in every phone, Android and iOS, right? Inside of consumer products and cars and everything like that. Even when the software is, kind of a proprietary kind of end stage, there's so much open source software included inside of that really addressing the security of the entire software ecosystem depends upon increasing that in the open source space. And in particular, we think, open source was kind of developed at a time when we had a really high trust environment. I could make a decision about whether to use OpenBSD or FreeBSD based partly on features, but also partly on who were the leaders behind those projects and how seriously did they take security or networking protocols or the like. And what were their policies about when somebody could accept a pull request, right? Could accept a patch. So that doesn't work anymore in a world where you've got thousands of components that get pulled in a modern, NPM based kind of like system, or simply just the proliferation of choices. Which fork of a popular package do you want to use, right? Well, all of those will have different approaches to security around them. And what has emerged over the last few years has been a set of standards and best practices and tooling and the such to really help raise that floor. And so the Open Ssf is here to try to organize those into one kind of consistent picture to support everything from best practice guides or training for developers on better security work to standards like SALSA or Project SIGSTOR, or the further promotion of SPDX as an SBOM standard. Apologies for all the acronyms. Happy to explain any of them if you're interested. And then some software as well. Project SIGSTOR, for example, is a collection of software for signing of releases using short-lived keys, much like Let's Encrypt did for promoting the adoption of TLS across the web. So all of that is kind of under one roof, and it's about hardening the software supply chain at the end of the day.
And of course, software supply chain and software bill of materials is on kind of top of everyone's mind this year. But Marty, Brian, I don't know why I said Marty. I'd said Marty earlier. Brian, as I sit here and I look back, so I've been, as I think I told you off camera, I've been involved in the security space 20 plus years, 25 years. And when I first got involved, when we talked about open source security, there were kind of two forks. There was open source security tools, like a Snort or a Nessus or ClamAV, these kinds of things, where these were actually security tools that security pros used that were open source. And they were some of the best. They were on par or better than many of the commercial tools. And then there was securing open source software. And back then, we're probably contemporaries on ages and stuff like that, so back then, the prevalent theme was, open source software had a lot more eyes on it, right? Because the source code was open to everyone, so it inherently somehow it was more secure. And some people bought into that. A lot of enterprises did it, right? Because, open source didn't come with support, it didn't come necessarily with training, and there was always this security bugaboo hanging in the background. Well, I don't buy into the more eyes on the code argument. And so it was hard. Open source software back then was getting snuck in the back door, if you will, of enterprises. Well, we fast forward to today, and 95%, I bet, of enterprises are using open source software one way or the other. So the idea that we're not going to use open source, that's done. The idea of how do we secure our open source, though, is still marred in controversy or not clarity. It's not clarified because, number one, I don't think most people understand what are the open source components that make up a lot of the applications that they're using or software they're using that can, has open source in it. And then number two, even for the ones who are using, are fully aware of open source projects and, software that they're using in their network, they're not really clear how to secure it. I think just the way they depend on the community for the software, a lot of them are depending on the community for the security of that software. And I guess that's your mission, right?
Yeah, the comparison to the old days is a really fun one to make. I mean, one of the reasons why the Apache web server project got started in early '95 was, all of us were users of the NCSA web server, and there was a security report that had come out about a way to bypass authentication. That because NCSA had lost their developers to Netscape, this new company at the time called Netscape, no one was home to issue an update. And so a bunch of us said, well, maybe we should kind of self-organize as users of the software to go and, fix that bug and then pull in these other patches that we had been trading around like baseball cards. That was the origin of the name, the Apache web server is Apache server. And that to me represents really what's different here compared to the proprietary software world is it's kind of like when people criticize the Wikipedia for having inaccuracies. Well, the Wikipedia, it might not be perfect, but it's perfectible, right? And likewise, open source software might not be perfect. In fact, I can guarantee you, there's a bug in every piece of software out there. The last bug is fixed and the last user has passed away. But it's improvable, right? And this is something that we need to think about as we, what are the approaches to improving that baseline of security is. But the virtue of it being transparent, the virtue of being able to fork and add improvements and that sort of thing is really a key part of the approaches that we should take. And it's really about asking, is there a community of people around a given piece of software who prioritize the security of it and recognize their role now that this stuff is critical infrastructure, now that it's like, highways and bridges, right? Now that it's like, parts of society could go down if certain things were taken down, especially given nation state actors' participation in cyber attacks these days, right? And so what is the obligation that not so much an individual open source developer, because, open source developers have lots of motivations for submitting pull requests, for being a maintainer, right? But really of the organizations in this space that have formed around open source, the named communities, the ones at the Linux Foundation for sure, but also groups like the Python Software Foundation or the Apache Software Foundation or the Free Software Foundation. What obligation do they have, arguably, to their downstream customers, so to speak, to adopt some practices or to at least telegraph, here's the amount of vetting that we do, here's the amount of attention that we pay, here's the last time we did a third-party audit of the code, right? You could even start to venture into places like, back in our time, you'd get to know that, okay, Theo de Rott on OpenBSD kind of took security seriously. He was kind of a jerk about it, but he took security seriously and he attracted people around it who did. And so I'm comfortable using OpenBSD for my border routers and other high security kind of spaces, right? Even if it had fewer features. You can't do that these days with the thousands of programs available. So are there other ways to do things like to add data to be able to manage, the fact that we're incorporating all these dependencies? So things like, you're probably familiar with the what used to be called the Core Infrastructure Initiative's Best Practices Badge. It's now been rebranded the Open Ssf Best Practices Badge. This is a set of questions about to open source projects and the foundations about how you run your projects. Do you have a security team? Do you have a process for responding when somebody reports a vulnerability to you, right? And lots of projects now display that badge, and they're percent of the way towards completing getting that badge, which is how many of the items on the checklist did they knock off. We have another thing at Open Ssf that builds upon that called security scorecards, which is a more automated tool to ask, are you doing things like pinning your dependencies, which would have avoided, the whole faker.js, color.js kind of thing that happened last month. To try to respond to the fact that we live in a world where people are updating their dependencies without doing a test and pushing these things to production. Maybe that's not a practice you all want to really do, right? So those are just a couple of the things that we're doing at Open Ssf to try to answer the question: how do you get a better sense for the risk posture of a given piece of open source software? What are ways to improve that baseline, and then what are ways to be able to, in aggregate, nudge developers, also companies, towards choosing packages with better security postures and creating incentives for developers to follow some of these things, rather than here's a 300-page thou shalt kind of document, right? That'll tell you what to do. I think that's the approach that we've all got to take to improve that baseline.
Agreed. Love it. All right. Let's pivot a little bit, if it's okay with you, Brian. You mentioned the sponsors, and some of the sponsors have now, kicked in monetarily, which has enabled OSSF to do a bunch of stuff. Let's, call out some of the leading sponsors, and let's talk specifically about, what that money's enabled, what's happening, what's news, around it, and it's a lot on there, but I'm going to let you cherry pick what you want to highlight.
Well, if you go to openssf.org, you'll see our members roster there. We've got members who participate at a premier level, who are part of our governing board and approve the budget I submit to them and how we spend their funds, and really help set kind of the strategic direction. And then a body of general members who are here to lend their support, lend their obviously contribute some funds as well. And then some really key partners as associate members. And what's fascinating is how, companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook, who also participated, are really competitive with each other, but none of them have a competitive interest in, security, right? Security is a baseline. When there's a problem out there, when there's a new hole discovered in an open source package, it affects everyone. And so this is one of the easiest places in all of the Linux Foundation I can think of to make the case that there really is a shared pain that comes from not solving this problem earlier. And so that work has enabled a bunch of our communities that have been very much driven the way the best of open source communities run, which is through public participation, public ideas. There's a tremendous amount of ideas coming out from that we can't take credit for having instigated, but what we're there to do is provide them support for. All right, so we're running Project Sigstore. Well, let's think about what does it take to actually support the service side of that, because just like Let's Encrypt, there's a services side, not just the provision of open source software to consume. So how do we make sure that is a service that can always stay up, so developers can always sign their packages, right? So that's one kind of thing we do. We've also looked at and have started to fund third-party audits for some of the software that's either in Open Ssf or that's peripheral to it. More on that will be updated soon. We launched this thing yesterday called Alpha Omega, which is about building a core set of software experts who will go and be able to engage with open source projects and help them understand how to adopt different security practices and policies and when they need help with a third-party audit, when they need help thinking about threat modeling, to actually be there and help deliver that. So all sorts of things going on this front, but it's also been great to see many of our members start to pick up on the technologies, partly because we've had this high-level engagement. So, for example, the NPM, as I mentioned, the NPM maintainers have picked up, are now required to use, or soon be required to use third-party, a second factor auth to be able to authenticate themselves to update their packages, which is a pretty important thing to do in trying to avoid one attack scenario, which is compromised credentials on key infrastructure. How the software gets distributed out to end users is blind spot I think a lot of us have as a weakness. And so it's great to see GitHub make a number of security-focused changes. Microsoft in other tooling space has started to do that. Google, for sure. Google committed $100 million to improving the state of open source software security. We haven't seen all of that money yet. We've seen a fraction of it, but they have done a number of programs to improve that out there. And so, but also there's some folks who are quiet about it. So Fidelity and Citibank and JP Morgan are huge consumers of open source software. They've started to be more public about that fact. They've started to contribute open source software back upstream. And they want to know, I mean, they have a keen interest when there's a new Log4j style vulnerability, how quickly can we update our systems and how quickly can we, get back to a point where we're not threatened by this. That's driven their participation in the program and even their involvement in some of the key underlying programs that we have. And so really, we're here to try to synthesize all of these interests into what's the greatest common denominator of everyone's agendas, and can we get resources to work against those?
Cool. Hey, Brian, we're running low on time, but wanted to just also mention, I know Linux Foundation is planning a lot of events this coming year, both virtual as well as in person. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Any plans for Open Ssf participation in any of them? Or maybe an Open Ssf?
Yes, in fact, they're coming up in June. The Linux Foundation is hosting its yearly open source summit event in Austin. The Open Source Security Foundation will be there in the form of a side conference called Supply Chain Security Con. This first debuted at KubeCon last year and had tremendous support. Now we want to make sure that's opened up to the broadest part of the open source ecosystem. So we'd love to see folks there in Austin. Well, there'll be a virtual side to that participation as well for those who won't be able to travel. But we're really looking forward to that and putting together plans to have presences at other major events and make sure that the folks who are working on important stuff in our community are being well represented basically everywhere software is being talked about. So, but Austin in June, we'd love to see folks there.
Great. Brian, I know you mentioned the website earlier, but would you mind repeating it again for folks maybe didn't catch it?
OpenSSF.org.
Got it. Hey, Brian, good luck. Best of luck with the Open Ssf. We're excited. We're fans here of it. Anything we can do, always reach out. And keep up the great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.
All right. Brian Behlendorf, General Manager, Open Ssf, part of the Linux Foundation. That's openssf.org. We'll take a break here on Techstrong TV, and we're going to be right back.
ContainerJournal.com is the leading online destination for centralized computing-related content. ContainerJournal.com covers all aspects of software containers, from container management, data management for containers, container security, networking for containers, to the entire container ecosystem, Kubernetes, microservices, serverless, and more. ContainerJournal.com has the largest selection of container-related news, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.containerjournal.com to learn more.
All right, welcome back. We've got the Haunted Hacker podcast now. This is part 2 of a 2-part conversation that host Mike Jones has with Dr. Gerald Auger, who is the chief content creator at Simply Cyber and the managing partner at Coastal Information Security Group. They talk about some of the things that happened this past year and what they expect to come this year. So, as always, it's a great conversation. So let's go ahead and roll it now.
It's funny you say that because this morning I was watching the news and I was watching the Today Show, and they had a guy on there that looked somewhat similar to Tom Cruise. And he and a graphic artist from Europe somewhere, I want to say Sweden, did this deep fake, and they're on TikTok. And he acts like Tom Cruise. He talks like Tom Cruise. And with the computer graphics, you can't tell the difference. And they were going over deepfake and how easy it is now as opposed to before. So before they were saying, oh, it used to take months to get this level of deepfake. Now it's taking like a number of days. So it's a huge, I guess, step for deepfake, but it also is a scary step. And I don't know if you've seen, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, obviously the Putin, Biden, Trump thing is clearly like an easy one, but business email compromise is where we make money, or we being a threat actor, they make money with business email companies. Hey, Mike, it's the CEO. I'm going to get on a plane. I need you to cut a check for $2 million to Jerry Enterprises, and they need it done before 5 o'clock because the deal's going to fall through. Okay, that email might be sniffed out as fraudulent. I've educated my end users. If it is a video recorded Zoom meeting of me, the CEO of the company, pissed off and telling you to do something, you're going to do it because why would your eyes deceive you? And I think that also could be a real, I don't know if it would be reported or not, but that could be a very real attack scenario as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen deepfake examples as far as Europe goes, and especially in Russia. I saw a couple deepfakes that were actually videos and put different people in different places at different times that they weren't supposed to be there. And it just by the naked eye, like you say, you can't really tell. But once they dove into it and dissected it and looked at the different parts, then yeah, you can tell. But in the heat of the moment, nobody's going to sit down and take that stuff apart and do the analysis before they react to a video. I mean, it's going to be right then and right there. Another great movie to watch, and people laugh, but I watched this the other day and it was really, really good. Was called Don't Look Up, and it was sort of a satire on our politics, our media, and an extraterrestrial threat as far as a comet. But some of the things that they were talking about, the way they portrayed the media, like you said, we're a media-driven company or country, and if the media says it, most of the world buys into it and jumps right on that bandwagon. I think that's a big threat too, is getting that media machine moving in the wrong direction. But as far as other threats go, I definitely think that we're going to see some geopolitical issues with technology. I don't think supply chain threat is going to go anywhere. I think that's going to, keep going down the same course. But I do see a switch in not so many large companies being attacked, but more small to medium businesses being attacked. The increase I've seen over the past 6 months for SMBs is just astronomical. And I don't know the solution for that because they're not losing enough money for the government to really take hold and take a look. But in the same token, these smaller and medium businesses are getting shut down. And those are the people that are your vendors, your smaller vendors, also play a part in supply chain. And like we've seen through the U.S., food supply and gas and all that, and especially with shipping, that threat is still going to maintain too. I think that maritime threat is going to be increased exponentially this year too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, was it NotPetya when that knocked out Merck in like 2017 or something? I mean, that was a nightmare. That was a logistics and shipping nightmare. You think of just like your Amazon package is a day late. Yeah, that's fine. But when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of shipping containers, it's real logistics, right? With cranes and trucks and coming and going and manifests and all that stuff. So yeah, it can be quite dramatic. One area that I haven't really, I want your thoughts on this, Mike. One area that I think is going to be very juicy target and see a lot of threat activity is in Web3 or Meta, right? So when I think about how threat actors think, and I'm by no means that bright, right? I'm more of a conformist than anything. But when I try to think about it, I always say follow the money, right? So crypto came out and people started hacking wallets, hacking exchanges, all these things. And now Meta's coming out and we're seeing, people buy $650 million, whatever, digital yachts. NFTs are huge. And I get that NFTs are unique, so you can't really steal them. But I just think with the way that we're pushing into this, virtual reality, immersed reality kind of life that it's just, there's going to be money there. There's going to be transactions there, whether it's US cash or, currency cash or in-game currency or whatever. I don't know yet, but I just think that if there's value to something in there and people haven't quite figured out how it works or how to secure it or how to operate it correctly, then it's going to be a target for attackers to investigate, to prod, to push, and to ultimately commit fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you look at Second Life and some of the other online games, those have been a target for attackers since day one. Anything that has any kind of in-game monetization or actual dollar value, they've been going after. And look at the early days of like PlayStation Network and stuff like that. They've always been a target as well. So you're right. I mean, anything that you can monetize, whether it be digital or not, especially digital, because you look at some of the games that kids play and the ability to buy things within the game. And since I was young and since my son was young, I would watch people hijack people's accounts and steal all their money through their account. And it may be digital currency, but I mean, the effect it has on the gameplay and the quality of service and actually, the confidence of the players, it changes. But the big push with NFTs, like that still amazes me. Like it just, it blows my mind. There was someone on Twitter this morning that, I guess she got on Twitter and found out that her image had became an NFT, and she was pretty pissed off about it. Like, I want this removed immediately. And I don't understand the big push towards that, because I know that's the route that we're going as far as currency goes. I know the dollar can't last forever, and we're starting to see some of the instability with the U.S. currency already. But I don't necessarily think virtual or crypto is the way to go. There's just way too many problems with it. And not only that, but you look at the sanctions we put on foreign countries like Iran and China, and what's the first thing they do when we put sanctions on? They run to crypto and start breaking crypto wallets and mining crypto. There's a big operation in China that was shut down last year, where there was multiple servers involved. And of course, the people in China that were responsible went to jail, but everybody runs to crypto when the currency gets, when there's an issue with the currency or the instability starts. And I think that's another area that we really need to look at as far as cybersecurity goes, is the blockchain. I mentioned this before, if the FBI can do it, anybody can. I mean, we all know that they have some talented people on their cyber team. I've interviewed a couple on the show, but they always come to security researchers to help them figure out the hard problems. So if the FBI can get in without help, then we're all in trouble as far as blockchain goes, for sure.
Yeah. I have another prediction that I think is more of a positive light. It is a threat, but one that I think everybody's going to really enjoy. I think 2022 is the year that passwords die, Mike. By and large, I think we're going to be passwordless in January 23. Yeah. So with Microsoft Windows Hello for Business, they've made this massive adoption push, especially in Windows 11, for this non-password authentication mechanism, and they've offered several. Right, with you've got the phone number, the text message, which were all traditional, biometric. Now they've got one where you can have a picture that you choose and you touch it in different places. All these things that are much more secure in regards to a password being compromised, and easier for end users, which, who doesn't like that? And it's just, everything about it is really positive. And I think once we have the infrastructure and technology in place to support the passwordless authentication schemes at a scale that is warrants, or not warrants, but at a scale that supports the load of the customer base for whatever it is, and its widespread adoption, then I think we'll do it. There'll still be Windows XP machines in manufacturing sites and stuff that just it'll be legacy tech. But I think for your cloud solutions and your main operating system and stuff like that will be passwordless, and we'll all love it. Our kids won't even understand why we use passwords. How, that doesn't even make sense.
Right. I totally agree. But do you think that going passwordless is going to end up taking us down the road of facial recognition and biometrics?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, there's always a trade-off, and I always kind of get like wrapped around the axle as far as how I feel about this with privacy and invasion of privacy versus convenience, right? So like I own an iPhone and I can use my face to unlock it, and the biometric print is inside the phone, right? But that doesn't mean it can't be pulled out by Apple. And then ultimately, I don't know if this is where you're going, but government surveillance and widespread surveillance, and then like complete erosion of privacy. I do think that's the case, but I mean, there's other options besides biometrics. It's just that biometrics is so difficult, not impossible, but with FIDO2 compliance, it's very difficult to compromise or fraudulently replicate. And it's super convenient because you never forget your face. Like you never leave your thumb in the car. You know what I mean? Like you don't accidentally leave your palm print at the hotel room. Like it's with you. You've always carrying it. And that level of convenience is fantastic. And if you're, whatever, you're had a couple too many beers and you got to pay the Uber driver, like, yeah, you might not remember like how to unlock the app to get to the multi-factor token or which picture you did. You could put your thumb on it and do it. Now, of course, that can be defeated or taken advantage of, right? So you pass out and your buddy then pays for his Uber with your thumb. These are some of the, trade-offs, but I just think our society is all about convenience, and end users specifically want the easiest path to complete their task. Their task is not to authenticate. Their task is to get payroll done or to make widgets or whatever. They don't care about that. You're just impeding their ability to get to what they need to do. And if that road can be smoother with fewer obstacles, then that's the road that the adoption is going to support and drive to, especially the business. Once the executives get a taste of passwordless, it's over.
Yeah, I agree too. But I do think that if the company that goes in that direction and starts leading us down that path happens to be one of the big three, let's say Google or Amazon or Meta, we're all in trouble. And it goes the same as AI. So I was talking to Max Hermeyer about this not too long ago. And I think that as a civilization, we're ready for something like that. But I do think that if it's created and maintained and harnessed by the wrong people, then it could be hugely detrimental to the whole planet. That again, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what Facebook did when they were like basically unregulated, ungoverned with all of that data, and they immediately monopolized it, and then secondary sources like Cambridge Analytica were able to weaponize it. And they didn't become the top 3 richest companies in the world because they weren't doing stuff like that. So I don't know how you would control it. You know what I mean? It's people, righteous people can have righteous decisions, but they are a private company that's driven by financial revenue. They can have a community outreach program and fair practices department, but at the end of the day, they're a publicly traded company with a responsibility to shareholders to make as much money as possible. And if that's an asset, I don't see how they couldn't. And, so we'll see with all this Oculus Quest 2 VR stuff. I mean, I think it's just a matter of time before you put the damn thing on and it scans your eyes and you're in as whatever.
Yeah. Especially I know China has been really cutting edge when it comes to facial recognition. But again, I don't know if I would trust their motives when it comes to producing, equipment or content based on facial recognition. So this upcoming year, you have the podcast, you have all the stuff that you do. What's in store for Gerald with these things in 2022?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm pretty excited. Actually, one of the early projects for 2022, I'm almost done working on it, is I'm developing an online course that, I've been doing Simply Cyber and helping people, and, I do webinars and stuff like that. But I've been asked so many times, where do I get training for red? Well, go do this. There's a million options. How do I get training for blue? Oh, well, you're lucky because in the last 18 months, several platforms have cropped up. And then they ask, where do I get training for GRC? And I never have a good answer. I always say, you can read NIST, but it's more of a reference than a training manual. But that's the best I got. And finally, one of these times I said, Jesus, I just, like, I have 15 years of GRC experience. I should just make a course that helps people. So I'm almost done with this practical GRC analyst course. And basically it's broken into several sections, like a risk section, a security awareness section, a governance compliance, a little bit of a cybersecurity primer, and then how to get a GRC analyst job at the bottom. But the nice thing is with each of the content pieces, like security awareness or compliance or whatever, there's the theory of what you need to know about the job and how it really operates in a professional setting. But then I have a lab section, which I think is kind of groundbreaking for GRC, frankly. And it's a lab section where we're going to actually do something like we're going to audit the AC family in a NIST 853 control framework. And this is like, these are the tools I would use when I do an audit, and here's how you would capture that. And then after you complete the practical lab module, you would get to it anyways, but you unlock like a couple resume bullets that you can copy and paste directly into a resume because you literally have just achieved that skill doing that lab. And I've got one for security awareness, one for compliance, one for audit, one for risk. And those are the modules really. And I just think it's going to unlock some opportunity for people who want to understand, whether they're new to the field or they're trying to get out of blue because they don't like working on holidays. Like, here is a primer on the core fundamentals of GRC. Like, if you go get a GRC analyst job, these are the things they're going to ask you to do. So here you go. So that's coming out probably in like, I'm going to do some beta testing in early January and then probably release it in early February. And I'm pretty excited about it. That's one of the bigger projects. And then, just Simply Cyber, I just started recently doing a daily morning cybersecurity news briefing that has been really well received. That's different than most of the Simply Cyber stuff I do, which is like live streams on Thursdays and weekly produced videos of core concepts on Mondays. So yeah, it's been good. It's all organic though. I couldn't have told you last year for predictions that I would have done first things first this year, but it seemed like the right thing to do at this time.
Yeah, I think that once you start like content creation and content development, it kind of takes on a life of its own, and this has been going on for a year. The Haunted Hacker's been going on for a year. We haven't changed a whole lot over the year. I think that, I like the same format. We used to have a lot of people on in the audience. We used to have an audience when we record, but I found that too distracting and too disturbing sometimes. So with this, it's more intimate and it's more of a discussion between, friends and just, kind of relaxed. But for me, this upcoming year is going to be kind of exciting as well. That I've been doing content creation for Alyssa Knight, and I have a screenplay that I wrote called Ransom, and it's going to be out in January or February, I believe, early next year. And we're doing short films for advertising for companies. So instead of your commercial or your brochures, companies are starting to buy these short films, these 10-minute films. And that's what we're doing, is we're creating this content for companies, which is really cool. Yeah.
I had someone send me the trailer to Ransom just yesterday and asked me to review it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I was really surprised when she asked me, and I'm kind of a fish out of water when it comes to screenplay writing. I've never written anything. I've never gone to that level of development, but I try to push the envelope and try to push myself. I think 2022, I'm going to be doing more of that. Really trying to dive off into different areas and learn more. I don't know about you, but I tend to get stagnant sometimes, where I get complacent, where I'm okay with just hacking, or I'm okay with just podcasting. And I think it's time for me as an individual to kind of step out and take some risk and learn some new stuff. So, I mean, as far as Gerald goes and the industry, what is your end goal? I mean, everybody asks me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I still haven't quite figured that out yet. But I know that I'm on the road that I enjoy, and obviously you are too, because listen to your podcasts and watching your shows, like your people love you, and you're super excited about doing it. Do you see that changing or developing into something new?
Yeah, the Simply Cyber community is a fantastic community. I really love those guys. No, so I've been a practitioner, more of a traditional route, like, went to a computer science education and then came out and did some technical stuff and then, worked my way up through GRC. And now I run my own security program. That was always like the career goal, was to run my own program. And I never really thought about Simply Cyber before I started creating it. But I've really, I feel like I've really kind of achieved a lot of the professional goals I had, in which is good because I love cybersecurity, and I got a PhD and stuff. So like I've really consumed as much as I can, and there's still so much that I don't know. Like there's tons and tons that I just don't know, which is my favorite part about cybersecurity because there's always something to learn. But I really want to. Simply Cyber went from like a hobby to like a regular thing to now something that has like people who I feel, I don't want to say depend on me, but have expectations and look like, I don't want to say I lead them, but like I provide a service to the community, and I take that role quite seriously. So I'd like to continue, honestly. Like we'll see where Simply Cyber goes. I know I've got some, we didn't get into all the details, but I've got some things lined up, some great guests for the live stream. I might increase the live streams from once to twice a week. I'd really like to do some more series type content where it's like, okay, let's do PNPT, right? For example. And like, I just don't have the time to properly edit it and piece it together. But like, okay, so we're going to go through PNPT, but that requires us to go through all of TCM's training. So let's do the OSINT course together. And then it's like more of a longitudinal, multi-episode mini series that kind of stands on its own as a season. But I'd love to do that in addition to maintaining the morning daily cybers and these live streams and stuff like that. I might actually pare back on my Monday produced videos because the community does love that. But it's a lot of time to produce a video versus a live stream. And I feel like if I did them every other week, I'd have more time to dig into some other projects, maybe, add an extra live stream a week and be able to do one a week and then still have 2 produced videos a month. So I'm kind of playing with the format. But as far as the long-term goal goes, I haven't really thought whether or not like I'd want Simply Cyber to be my full-time job or, leave practice or anything like that. But I'm just, it's so cliche to say I'm taking it one day at a time, but like it is very organic. It's all mine. So I get to decide, when I work, how I work, what I work on, which is really, really therapeutic for me. Because I get to dive into what like Log4j happened, right? Like I need to know about it to do my own job. So let's just spend all day Saturday learning about it, spin up a Spring Boot, roll and roll app, use John Hammond's tool, ding, look at it, cool. And then why not share this knowledge with some people who may not be able to technically set up the Spring Boot and get a VM going. Like, it's easy if you know how to do it, but if you don't, it's hard. So why not make that for someone else? And I just really enjoy that. So I'm hoping Simply Cyber continues to grow and organically develop in ways that both delivers value to the community and makes me happy and my personal life too. I do have a family and wife and children that I do enjoy spending time with. And it all has to flow together. It's got to be very Tai Chi-ish,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I tend to find myself doing 3 or 4 recordings a week and then, wearing myself down. I don't think at this point I could even have a family with my schedule. And balance is not something I'm very good at. So I try, and it's really important for people who listen that, you definitely have to have some sort of balance or you burn yourself out pretty quick. But yeah, any last thoughts before we go? And I really appreciate you being on. This has been a pleasure as usual. And I always love just picking your brain. Like, I look up to you in the community and I know a lot of other people do as well. So it means a lot to have you on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. Yeah. I love being on the show. I love talking with you. It's always like a very intelligent, thoughtful conversation that really, getting other people's perspective in the field is always important to really putting your own perspective, not just challenging your own perspective, but giving you context to think differently So you can see a situation, a scenario, a problem, a threat, whatever, from multiple angles, and not just putting all your biases in. I guess I would just say, for the upcoming year, since that was kind of the focus of our conversation, I'm starting to see a lot of people posting on LinkedIn about I just got this job. So I'm hoping that, I don't know if it's budgets coming out or people getting more serious about cybersecurity, or all the work that people have been doing in 2021 to set themselves up for success in 2022 is beginning to pay dividends. But I guess I'm just hoping that all the work that people have been putting in is really turning into work and jobs, and the networking and all that. I mean, I met you through networking, and I'm very glad I did. And I'm seeing a lot of people listen to that guidance, because a lot of people like yourself and myself and other people in the industry, that's what they're saying. You need to network. You need to contribute. You need to listen. You need to be part of what's going on. And I'm seeing people do that. And I really think that, it's not just us listen to ourselves speak. It's sage advice that's truly, taking effect.
Absolutely. I can't agree more. And definitely not listen to myself. As a matter of fact, I don't even listen to my podcast after they're recorded. I can't stand the sound of my own voice. So a lot of people don't know that. But thanks again for being on the show. And you and your family have, happy holidays, what's left of it. And I hope you prosper and you have good luck in 2022. And we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I'll have you on Simply Cyber.
Awesome. Thanks, Gerald. Have a good one, man.
All right. Cheers. Bye.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Next up, we have the latest in our DevOps Unbound series. This one talks about cloud performance testing and what organizations need to keep in mind. This is a conversation that hosts Alan Schimmel and Mitch Ashley have with Kristen Webb from Tricentis, Donald Lutz from Taos, Andreas Grabner from Dynatrace, and they are talking about the key benefits of performance testing in the cloud and what to consider when building a cloud performance testing strategy. Great stuff. Lots of takeaways. Let's go ahead and roll it now.
Hey everyone, it's Alan Schimmel, CEO of Techstrong Group, and you're watching another DevOps Unbound. For those of you who may be new to our audience, DevOps Unbound is a bi-weekly video series sponsored by our very good friends at Tricentis, and we explore a wide range of topics around DevOps and DevOps-related technologies, practices, processes, and people. As I said, we do this bi-weekly, as every other week for those who are a little challenged. And then around once every month, we also have a live, what we call roundtable format of DevOps Unbound, where we'll have usually a little bit of larger panel. But we have a really large panel in that we open it up to a live audience, and you and everyone joining are invited to participate in the roundtable by interacting with the panel and our host, asking questions, giving us your thoughts, and it really becomes sort of a group town hall kind of meeting. When it goes right, it's great with wide levels of participation. Actually, this is a really good point that good time to bring this up. Today's panel version of DevOps Unbound is on a holistic approach to performance testing. But the upcoming, or the next live roundtable, and I'm going to have more information on that later in the show, is later this month on February 24th, which is a Thursday, and it's going to feature performance testing in the cloud. I'll give you the actual title in just a bit. But one of our panel members here, Kristen is going to be there, as well as some other great guests. You can sign up for that on DevOps.com if you go to webinars, upcoming webinars, and check it out. It's February 24th. So, and as I said, I'll bring more information on that in a little bit. But for now, let's talk about a holistic approach to performance testing. And in doing so, I think the right place to start is with our audience. I've already kind of pre-announced Kristen, so I'm going to ask her to go first if it's okay. Hey, Kristen, welcome to DevOps Unbound. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. Kristen Webb here. I am the Director of Product Marketing at Tricentis, currently running the product line around Neoload, our performance and load testing solution. I have about 20-something years in technology. I've lost count. I've worked for a long time on the product development side. So I remember back when we were testing large software releases at Macromedia and Adobe and trying to get our products out on time as part of a broader release and making sure there was no watermelons, is what we used to call the performance bottlenecks at the end of our 3-week, mean time between failure testing. So performance testing is near and dear to my heart, as is all application development, background, and excited to be here.
Absolutely. Macromedia, that's a name I haven't heard in so long. It used to be such a big part of my workplace, and I just totally blanked on it until you mentioned that. It was like, but it brought back good memories, so that's a good thing. Yep, a smile to my face. Next up, I want to introduce you to Andreas. We call him Andy. It's Grabner, yes, Andreas?
It is, but feel free to pronounce it the way you like, as long as you call me Andy. I always make the joke, if you call me Andreas, then I typically did something wrong or rude, because my mom calls me Andreas if I did something not appropriate.
I get it. Our youngest son is Bradley, and everyone calls him Brad. And you say Bradley, and he kind of, he knows he's in trouble. But anyway, Andy, welcome. Introduce yourself to the audience, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So my first start in performance engineering was, I think, pretty much 20 or 21 years ago, maybe now. I was working at Segway Software. I was a performance tester on a performance testing tool called Silk Performer, still around. But I remember those days, and it was a large load testing project. And with my first kind of customer gig that I did. And I also remember that my performance engagement that was scheduled for 1 week took exactly 10 minutes, because we broke the system with 2 virtual users. And the virtual user was my left finger and my right finger hitting the refresh button on 2 different keyboards. And I really quickly learned that performance testing, while we always think about the magic 10,000 millions of virtual users, sometimes is as simple as just hitting refresh quite a lot on your website. Over the years, I evolved from a performance engineer. Now I'm working at Dynatrace for the last 14 years, actually, in the observability space, and I'm a self-proclaimed DevOps activist. I really like the idea behind DevOps, and I try to use channels like yours and my own channels to really advocate for what DevOps allows organizations to do in terms of tooling transformation, people transformation, process transformation. So, and I'm very glad to be here.
Excellent. Thank you and welcome, Andy. Thanks for being here. Our third panel member today is someone I've had the pleasure of knowing.
I don't know, Donald. It's got to be 20 years.
It's 20 years. Yeah, it's
20 years.
Was on our original team at Still Secure, what became Still Secure with Mitchell and I. But he is a developer testing person extraordinaire. I'll let him introduce himself. I don't want to embarrass him.
Our friend Donald Lutz. Hey, Donald, welcome.
Welcome. My name's Donald Lutz. I've been doing software architecture for probably about 30 years. I've been focused on how to do development right, how to use design patterns correctly. The past 10 years, I've really dropped in the cloud. Right now, I'm the senior cloud and software architect at Taos. We're a public cloud company. IBM just acquired us. Frost & Sullivan rated us #1 for public cloud. We also are on the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So I'm sort of spending a lot of time helping us productize our consulting offering. So the whole idea of testing and how to do performance testing right and chaos engineering, those are really near and dear to my heart. And how do you use the right design patterns in your code to avoid all these performance issues?
Well, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say, right? And we'll get to it. Our last member, though, is my co-host and friend, Mitchell Ashley. I'm going to let Mitch introduce himself, though. Mitch, take it.
Well, good to be here with everybody. Thanks for making me follow some really 3 tough people to follow. Oh my gosh. And by the way, Macromedia, Dreamweaver, Authorware, remember all that good stuff. And I've known Donald tack on another 10 years. So it's a small world. No, I'm CTO with Techstrong Group, working with Alan, and I also am principal with our analyst firm, Techstrong Research. So great to be here. And I think we could fill up our whole session with war stories about performance testing, Andy. Maybe we'll save that for another day, right? But good to have everybody here, and thanks to the audience for joining us.
Thank you, Mitchell. You know, just real quickly, I think back to performance testing. It's still secure, Mitch, if you remember. You know, broke our budget because we didn't have all the virtual, you weren't able to do it from one machine then. You actually had to go out to like a place that had, enough to do a load of,
kept Dell busy sending us more servers.
Man, was that crazy. Anyway, though, let's jump in. In my mind, one of the most overused words I hear in tech is the word holistic. So let's jump on that. When we talk about a holistic approach to performance testing, is it really holistic, or are we talking about, hey, what's a great approach to performance testing? How should we be doing performance testing?
I can take that to start. So building on what Andy was saying earlier about his 2 fingers being, the load test to start, I think what we mean by holistic, or just the sound approach to performance testing, is, starting with the code, starting with the APIs, starting at, one user, and making sure before you check your code in, or your API in, your microservices in, that does this code work for one user? And then, as you go through your development process and you start to build the components of your application and you integrate those components, you start to hit those components with, maybe 100 or so users, and you're getting feedback along the way. So that by the time you have an application integrated within your whole system that mimics pre-production, by then you're able to, hit the load at, hundreds of thousands potentially. But you already had feedback along the way, feedback loops to say, what's performing, what's not, what do I have to fix along the way, so that by the time you get to the really high load, you have fixed a lot of the issues. And what you're fixing at the end is, what do I need to tweak within my system to make sure this application or API is going to perform? So that's one part of holistic, or we need to think of a better word. Maybe the word I tend to use is standardization. You need to cover all your bases along the pipeline, but you also need to make sure you're covering all your protocols and all your use cases. So having a standardized approach for everything from API to monolith, like we just talked about, but also what are all the protocols you're covering, from HTTP to JavaScript to SAP and Citrix, having an approach that works for all the protocols and across all those use cases, and whether it's from the protocol perspective or even the browser, because those are 2 different types of performance tests. But and also one that's the third thing I think about in terms of standardization is like the skill set for the people who are going to be doing the performance testing. So you want to be able to not only have your center of excellence be able to performance test, but as you move to DevOps, you want to be able to have a more distributed model for who can participate in the performance testing process. And create more of a self-service approach so that a lot of times, if they can access a browser, they can run a performance test, they can share results. And that encompasses having, the approaches both for performance testers who want to build within CI pipelines with an as code approach or a CLI, or for the groups that want to use more of a no-code approach with a GUI tool. So those are the three things that I would say mean what we mean when we think about holistic.
Love it. Thoughts on that, team, panel? Agree, disagree? You want to add?
I wanna add something. Again, I'm not a native speaker, so maybe the word holistic means also something different to me. But I want to add one thing and then add a second thing to it. The first thing, what you said, Kristen, is I think at the beginning you said developers need to understand actually how their code is doing with 1 users and 5 and 10 and 20 users. I think what we're talking about here is people understand where are their breaking point and where are the scalability issues. Because I think if you are building new code, however small or big it is, if you put it under different sets of load, and we don't have to go to the millions of users, but if you look at it at 10, 100, and 1,000, you immediately know where are your connectivity issues between your components, and as you're scaling the load, where things may break apart and where don't they scale, right? Because obviously we can throw a lot of hardware on a problem and we somehow get performance, but at a certain cost. So I think it's very important, as you said from the beginning on, make developers understand where they may have some bad architectural decisions that will later on cost them a lot of money in order to scale this. I think that's one thing. But for me, holistic also means not only looking at it in development and starting early, but for me, holistic means I first need to understand what are my real performance goals, right? If I'm developing a new feature, a new app, I should sit down with whoever comes up with the idea and trying to get their thought on what do you expect from my software? How should it run under certain load, right? It's like our non-functional requirements in production. And then really take this and then break it down into what does this mean for me as a developer? To give you an example, if we are building a new mobile app and let's say there's a feature to log in, how long do we expect the login to take? Let's say a second. Okay, if it is a second under 10,000 users, what does this mean for me as the developer that implements 2 or 3 APIs in the backend? So I think the term of a performance budget is something that I also hear and have heard over the years. So if you break down performance as we agree on with the business, if we have performance goals, and then we can break it down into more technical goals to the individual teams, then we, I think, take a holistic approach, because then everybody can really work on their component and really always make sure that their component is working and operating within the context of the performance budget that they have, so that there's a higher chance that in the end, when all the components are put together in production, we're actually meeting our business our business and our performance requirements in production. So I think these are kind of the two things, right, that I wanted to add.
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. Well, the thing I think about a lot is because I've been building a lot of microservices over the past 10 years and thinking about synchronous versus asynchronous communication and how that plays out. Because if you have too many APIs, you have to use things like circuit breakers. There are a lot of things that can affect that. So if you start looking at things like Kafka, where do I split my workload so it's asynchronous? How does that work? What patterns do we put in there? That makes a big difference, because most developers are always thinking synchronous. And I find that to be a real difficult issue, because you know what, we could put this in the background. It's it's always when you look at Amazon, just because you placed an order doesn't mean that actually went in and got billed against your card immediately. That whole asynchronicity concept has to be embedded in the concept of performance.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's also a nice decoupling of components, right? I mean, that's the event-driven model, as you call it, right? You put a queue in the middle, but it's basically event-driven architecture, and very important piece. And because the event-driven architecture also allows you to better test and also performance test components in isolation, and then also come up with better capacity planning models, right? Because you know how many events fall out of the first component when you put a certain load on it. That means how do we need to size the queues or wherever it ends up, and then what do we need on the other end to work on the queues? Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
But I think the topic is also, maybe that's why holistic is being overused, Alan. The topic has not only evolved, I think it's grown because, I remember one of my first experiences working with Donald was an SMTP gateway server, a third-party product, and he was new to me, and he knew how to tune it. We called it tuning then, right? But the load, the capacity, the scalability, and we've added on to that customer experience or user experience goals, metrics, how long does it take to log in, that kind of thing. What's the experience to get back a response on a mobile devices versus on a web browser, whatever that might be? What's our API performance goals to partners and third-party services, things like that. So I think that's made the world a little bit more complex, maybe a lot more complex to deal with, but it also has brought us closer to what the end result is we're trying to accomplish with whatever system or software is, deliver this service or make this function happen for whatever it might be. Kind of help us also think across the system, horizontally and vertically of what we're trying to deliver.
Yep. I think there's another element, though, that I'm interested in your all thoughts on. Liz, when I think back to over my career, how performance testing has changed, what have been the big factors? Well, I think as Andy referenced early on, man, it was hardware dependent, right? Because if you wanted to scale performance testing, you had to be able to test it on the hardware it was running, and that got expensive quickly. And not only expensive for the actual cost of the equipment, but from a people perspective, right? And then, the virtualization of performance testing, wow, what a godsend. We could just have Andy here working with his, as he said, his left and his right index finger. And that was enough to break the app he was testing, or the software he was testing at the time. And, and then I think, with DevOps and testing and so forth, the idea of automating our performance testing, right? Being able to shift it further left into our development process, right? Because it used to be, you did all your coding, and that took 1 month of your 3-month cycle, and now 2 months of that 3-month cycle were your testing cycles, right? And man, by shifting left, I really cut that out a bunch. All of these profound changes, right, are in performance testing. As we sit here today, can we say that there really is a best practices, holistic or not, approach to performance testing? And what is where's the people part of it, right? There's always people, process, and technology. What's the people part of that? Kristen, would you mind kicking it off, or? Okay.
So I think there is some approaches that are best practices-ish. And one of the first steps is really understanding where your priorities are in your applications and where the risky areas are, because you can't test everything. So you need to really prioritize what to test first and where the issues are most likely going to come up. And two, after you do that, it's about establishing what your SLOs are, your service level objectives, and understanding, what do you need to hit within what, level of virtual users hitting that, within what time, response times, and what you want that end user experience to be like, and building those SLOs within the pipeline so that when you're running the tests in a continuous manner, you're able to say, this didn't hit the SLO when we ran it against, XYZ load, and you send that back and you have actions based on that result to, fail the build, for example, send a ticket to Jira, so that it's integrated within your already existing development process, is a good way to go about it. And then also, taking in production feedback is a good part of this too, to make sure that you're understanding what's actually going on within production, and are my tests mimicking taking the real world experience that my users are having under what load conditions, and making sure you're updating your Kubernetes environments to match that level of code. Do you need a new cluster based on that information that you're getting from either EPM tools like Dynatrace or other monitoring tools like, Prometheus or Microsoft Monitoring, and, bring that observability data back into the test definitions. And updating them continuously to make sure you're keeping up as things change, because in reality, things do change. I mean, we have seasonality, or we have new marketing campaigns that, maybe a business that went digital, now they need to keep up with, their spikes in load. So you want to be able to stay ahead of that instead of reacting.
Agreed. Panel? Thoughts?
The telemetry idea has been really the past 2 years. I've been doing a lot of open telemetry so we can know what's happening at every point. We put in Elk, we put it in Datadog, we put it all over the place, but also the whole Kubernetes cluster thing. How do you monitor it correctly? What's the right thing? There are a lot of tools that I've used, but there's the whole Kubernetes thing opens up a larger can of worms because of the way the control loop works in Kubernetes. So you have to kind of figure out how do you want to deploy them? What do the environments look like? What's the appropriate load testing there? That's why I've got into a lot of chaos engineering, breaking things in production, seeing what happens. I just turned this service off. Oh, it doesn't talk to Slack anymore. Where's all those messages going? Did we notice it's not working? That whole idea, I think, is really valuable. Surprisingly, it makes developers very neurotic. They don't like it a lot because you're basically saying, it's sort of like doing improv because we're just going to do it and turn stuff off. And they're like, well, I think it works, so it's sort of a very strange response.
It is. Andy, you're a Dynatrace, right? This is kind of right up your alley there of what you guys do.
Exactly. Yeah. And so to add what you already said, both of you already said, on a very mature scale, I think of people that I see, they just go always straight into production and maybe, using canaries or feature flags and just, deploy their new code and then expose it to, let's say, a small percentage of users. And I'm saying about the very mature, this is what we would love, obviously, more people to do, but the reality is just a small number of organizations can really do it. But that's the ideal scenario. You deploy, you use your telemetry to figure out, did that code change now? Does it actually behave better or worse than what's maybe currently out there? What I want to add, I think also what Christian said, I think what we need to do is we need to get closer to the developers from the beginning. I know there's different terms, and I'm just throwing one more term out there, performance-driven development, because I think we've taught engineers, and I'm an engineer by trade as well, right? We've taught them over the last 10, 20 years to do test-driven development, where you write your unit tests and functional tests to cover functionality. I think we should also educate them to do performance-driven development, which means you are, as you write your new microservice that exposes 5 APIs, then write your API test that you can run once or can run continuously or with multiple virtual users to actually generate some load. And I think tools have become much more developer friendly. Kristen, again, pointing to you, I know you have a great product where you actually allow developers to define their stuff as code, right? And code could be something like YAML or JavaScript, whatever it is. But I think as the tools have matured and we are making it easier and more natural for developers to also write these types of tests, I think we will also get more adoption. I think that is very important, because we always talk about shifting left. It's a great term, but shifting left in the end, if you think about, if you take everything and shift everything left, we put all the burden on the developers. And I think this is nothing that is sustainable. Therefore, we need to make it as easy as possible also for developers to do all the things that we ask them to do. So that means we need to give them tools that are natural to them in their habitat, which means in their IDE, right? They need to be able to check in code, and as part of their commit process, they then need to automatically not only get feedback on code coverage and functional coverage, but also, hey, your code change now has slowed down your performance by 20%. Are you aware of this? Or you're consuming 50% more memory. And by the way, and then bringing in Donald, what you said, also learning from production, then you can correlate that with your production data and say, hey, your service runs in production with a certain amount of instances. And if you are making this code change, it means you have 50% more memory consumption. Are you aware of the additional costs? So there's a lot of things I think that we need to do, but it starts with really enabling developers just to do more in their natural kind of environment that they're in. Yeah.
And I'm going to build on what you're saying, Andy, because I want to make sure I'm clear about what I mean about shifting left. And I do think it is bringing it to the developer, but as a service. So I think of it as building out a self-service rather than putting the onus on the developers to build the performance testing within the pipeline. So if it's automated in the pipeline that they're operating within, then it's really up to the performance engineer to build out, and the automation engineer to build out that testing, platform for them, so that really they're just kind of functioning, like you said, within their IDEs and within their whatever they're using to check in. And really, they're just getting a feedback once they do, so that they know how to act, in the moment, about how their code's performing for that one user to start, and then later, as they get further on, they get more information about an increase in load to a few hundred, maybe once they have, like you said, a microservice that might expose more APIs. And, once you're distributing, your code like that, how is it going to impact other code, and how is other impact code and endpoints going to impact the new code that you introduce? So really kind of delivering that. And that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of creating a self-service approach so that more people can participate in the process. But, the performance engineers are still the masterminds behind building that.
I have a question for the panel. I'm curious how do you think about this aspect of it? Part of maybe for me, a better word than holistic is systemic, thinking about how all parts fit together to contribute to the performance you're delivering, as well as other things. It's not just testing our app and our app code, it's testing the whole stack vertically and variations of that, different environments that it might run in. And a lot of it's not our code. Donald was talking about Kubernetes just as one great example. Is that part of what we mean by holistic as well?
I think so. To me, one of the things I think about the holistic problem is that you get all these CI/CD pipelines built, but you don't have a GitOps process that keeps the platform aligned. You're working on that. So fundamentally, you don't have the cluster. You're not doing infrastructure as code with the cluster as effectively as you need. Therefore, when developers deploy code through it runs all the tests, but fundamentally part of the cluster didn't get, so I've been thinking a lot lately in my current position, how do we get across our whole organization, GitOps deployed in all elements of our groups? So we're using that effectively with everything else we do, because that is the one piece that is happening. Argo CD is a great example. It works really well, but just getting that to happen and realizing you're building a platform is also a thing that people need to think about.
Agreed. You know what? I just want to throw another log on the fire. So, cloud, game changer, makes no difference, easier, harder. Donald, you're the kind of the voice of the developer here, as well as IT. What do you think? And cloud, that you work with a public cloud provider.
Yeah, I mean,
what do you?
Public cloud is what we focus on fundamentally. That's what we're doing for all our customers. And cloud is simpler but more complex at the same time, because they're fundamentally companies are used to having their various people within their data center, and when you move to the cloud, it's upsetting. They have to figure out how to move all the workloads. But it's also one of the things that cloud gives that I've been thinking a lot about is if you can work with all three public clouds, you start increasing your reliability in everything. But how do you contain the cost? So I can run this in GCP, this in Azure, this in AWS. Companies want to go there, but they're sort of always going, how do I do that? Why do we do that? What do all these terms mean? And how do you sort of get, the various executives to understand? Because we're trying to sell them on sort of the advisory services. This is why you should do this. This is how you get your DevOps working. This is all these things. This is what you should do with Open Ssf. It's a really complicated soup because, they feel like it's sort of like what happens in a lot of industry. They've outsourced it to all these people. And what are all these people doing? Are they really making a Pinto, or are they making a fancy, car? What are they doing?
Fair.
I mean, I'm curious, Donald, how you guys do performance testing for the public, but I will say that cloud is a game changer in a lot of ways, because it's not eliminating risk, right? It's just moving it from one place to another. It's shifting it from on-prem to the cloud, and also introducing new risk and new considerations that didn't have to be made before. And with auto scaling systems, sometimes people assume that moving to the cloud means that implicitly they don't have to worry about performance anymore because of auto scaling. And the concern there is that when you're in the cloud, you're really bumping up against a lot more services. And you can also run into noisy neighbors and a lot of different scenarios that will introduce bottlenecks from distributed systems. I mean, you could have your SaaS application located in France, your hardware located in China, and your middleware in a third location. And you need to make sure that a hybrid system like that is going to perform, and it can be assumed that it would just because it's the cloud. And you really need to make sure that you're, whether you're migrating apps or replatforming them, that you have a baseline of performance tests that you're measuring against to make sure that you don't regress when you move to the cloud, and that you're able to test those again once you do move there.
And I have another thought I'd like to add to that, because I've sort of done it. You run all your services in pick an AWS, Azure, or GCP. And then there's the other thing where you say, well, I want to run all my services in Kubernetes in all three public clouds. I don't really want to consume the services directly from the provider. There's some new cool APIs that are out there where I just want to consume it in Kubernetes. So you've changed the idea that your hybrid is really Kubernetes wherever it runs. So then you're not really consuming it in the public cloud, you're consuming the services through the cluster. So that also changes the whole discussion.
Maybe what I want to quickly add, and my first response to your question, Alan, was it doesn't matter because it shouldn't matter. The same with cloud native. When we talk about cloud native doesn't mean your cloud native apps have to run in the cloud. Cloud native really means how you architect your apps, and they can essentially run anywhere, right? So it's not where. Cloud native doesn't define where it runs, but how the system runs. And this is why I think, also to Christian's point, you don't get let's say performance for free, or you cannot sign up for performance as a service or for resiliency as a service just by checking a box on your favorite cloud provider, and then all of a sudden you have magic happening, right? You still need to factor all of these decisions into your architectural decisions that you make, and you have to do the proper testing in the end. I also think that the cloud was great because all of a sudden we got a lot of services that we could build upon and really focus on, let's say, business value that we could generate, because we didn't have to, invest time in, maintaining a database or maintaining your load balancers and stuff like this, because somebody took care of it. So I think overall the cloud was a great thing. From a testing perspective, to add one more thing, and I think also, Kristen, you said it again, if you have to make smart decisions where your software runs, because you always need to have in mind where your end users are, where your consuming services are, because that also means you need to test from those locations, because you may now have different latency, you may have different costs out of a certain data center, out of a certain cloud provider. I think these are some of the additional considerations. But in general, for performance and for performance testing and scalability testing, in theory, it shouldn't matter whether my application that I've architectured well runs in one cloud, in three clouds, or on premise. That's kind of my answer. It shouldn't.
Alan, too, I think one of the real game changers about the cloud is just access to resources. In any organization, when you do it internally, the two greatest bottlenecks are acquisition of hardware and firewall rules, to be straight about it. And you can kind of control your own environment, whether it be resources or security, wherever it might be. But that flexibility gives you more, not just more options. You can rethink how you can automate how you set up an environment. Let's configure it this way. There's permutations, or we're thinking about changing it in some specific way, and you can automate how you test that. So it seems that it gives you a lot more flexibility. Sometimes flexibility means complexity too. Mm-hmm. But that to me was one of the biggest game changers of moving to the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, with hardware being the most expensive part of performance testing, and like you said, it's difficult and time consuming to go through IT to procure resources, to get them provisioned, to make sure you can access them at the right time and there's no conflicts. So what you're talking about really is more of the app development, app testing within a cloud CI system, which is a whole nother level in addition to, application deployment in the cloud. That's really exploding too. And it does minimize, we have with Neoload SaaS, you can get up and started and run a performance test within 5 minutes now, because it's a fully managed service using AWS and Google, and we do that for you. So it is a game changer in that way too. But also, this is where I do disagree with Andy a little bit. Like, wherever your app is, it has to perform, it has to run well. But the cloud does introduce more risk because, well, first of all, it's shifting the risk from on-prem to cloud, but it's also you're going to hit a lot more services now, particularly where you have a new architecture, where it's a modernized architecture, and it could be a what are they calling it, like a microlith now. So more services are going to be affecting you in that architecture. It could be really unrelated, and when you have that kind of a distributed system, you might not know where the bottleneck is coming from.
I think the cloud does introduce more complexity, if you will. But look, the advantages of cloud, I think, far outweigh the disadvantages of cloud, right? I think there's chips on both sides of that scale. But you know what? I mentioned in the beginning that, in addition to this pre-recorded DevOps Unbound episode, February 24th, we do have the live roundtable for our audience. So I'd like to invite everyone that's watching this, if you want to learn more about what to consider in building a cloud performance testing strategy, we do have this live roundtable. We have folks from Dynatrace and Tricentis and more joining us on February 24th. The roundtable, funny enough, is called Strategies for Performance Testing in the Cloud. And if you go to DevOps.com under the webinar section, you can sign up for this webinar right there. We're calling it a webinar. It's a live roundtable. You will have a chance to have your questions answered, to speak to the panel members directly via chat, and help you with your strategy. So don't miss that, February 24th, just a few weeks from now. Guys, we're running low on time. I'd like to throw one other kind of question out at the three of you, and for our audience's benefit. Right? Okay, you convinced me. I need a holistic approach to performance testing. Other than listening to the five of us on here today, can you point me to some good places, if I'm in the audience, where I can go find out more about this, where I can get smart quick? Donald, we let Kristen lead off everything, so if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to go first on this one.
There's a couple books I like that aren't necessarily about performance testing, but one of them, I always forget the name. It's over there, Building Microservices by Sam Newman. It's a really good book it's his second edition came out. There's another one that came out by the guys at oh God, I can't think of where they were, but to me, that's a great reference because it covers everything from culture to how you build your microservices, how to performance test it. I like a lot of written things. There are various videos that are out there. There's a couple that Martin Fowler did that talk about this in particular. So those are kind of the things off the top of my head.
So I think Sam Newman, like Martin, were with ThoughtWorks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he's independent now. He went off on his own, and now he just
they
consults.
did leave. I remember. Yep. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is a little commercial on what we do on the side at Dynatrace, we have a holistic approach to SLOs, to service level objectives, with our CNCF project Captain, spelled KEPTN, it's a CNCF project. And what we do there, we are providing event-driven orchestration to actually embed performance engineering as part of your delivery process, but also as part of your operational processes. And there's a great integration also with Neotis, with Neoload. So that means we actually provide a framework on top of Kubernetes to enable developers to simply check in their code, and then Captain is orchestrating the deployment, the testing, like triggering a Neoload test, and then automatically evaluating your SLOs, and then pushing it forward all the way into production, but always evaluating SLOs. So always evaluating your performance criteria, your resiliency criteria, your business criteria. So if there's one thing, check out Captain, our CNCF project, because I think it will definitely contribute towards having a more holistic approach to performance engineering.
Thanks, Andy. Kristen, I saved you for last.
Thanks. So a couple things. One is we have a performance advisory council that is run through Tricentis, but really it's not about product as much as it's about approaches. It organizes all the performance, experts from around the world, including Andy. I think you participated in it a lot. And Henrik, who is going to be joining me on the webinar later in the month, used to run those performance advisory councils, and he's at Dynatrace now, so he's a great resource as well. But we have a site for the Performance Advisory Council where you can see all the recordings of experts around the world, telling their stories about what they found worked for them, and what their learnings were, and how they integrated with various development processes. In addition to that, on tricentis.com/Neoload, there's a ton of information about the problems that Neoload is addressing and how we're addressing them, the integrations we have across traditional tech stacks and the DevOps tech stack, and how we work with Dynatrace to help shift right and bring that production feedback, along with all the monitoring tools for that observability. We also have a trial that's available to learn more.
I love it. Hey, Kristen, thanks very much. Again, just to reemphasize, Kristen mentioned it, February 24th, strategies for performance testing in the cloud with some really great, smart people, including Kristen. Check it out on DevOps.com. You can register. You do need to register to attend that live roundtable, though. Hey, Mitchell, I'm going to let you take it home.
Well, thanks, Alan. I was just reflecting and really absorbing what our panelists had to say today. And the thing I take away is I'm impressed with the sophistication of how we think about, and the sophistication of the people who work in testing. Now, long gone are the days of testers or people who didn't like to code, right? Or developers that didn't like being developers. We've got some extremely brilliant thought leadership happening in testing, whether it be in the products that are being created, people that are trying to solve, both complex problems and sometimes fun ones too. So it's kind of a renaissance for testing time for me. It's a great time to be a tester. It's a great time to be a QA person and a software engineer working with test. So it's a fantastic topic, and I hope people will check out the resources that everybody suggested.
You're right. It is. There's an old Irish proverb, may you live in interesting times, or something like that. It's great times to be a tester. Anyway, Donald, Andy, Kristen, thank you so much for being on our panel today. Mitchell, as always, thank you. To our audience, thank you. We hope you found this interesting. And if you did, again, I'll beat the drum one more time. February 24th, Strategies for Performance Testing in the Cloud. Sign up for it. Don't miss it. I think it's going to be a great one. But until then, this is Alan Schimmel for DevOps Unbound. Many thanks to our sponsor, Tricentis. Thanks to all of you for watching in, and we'll see you soon on another DevOps Unbound.
CISO Talk, to hear how real-world CISOs are dealing with today's real-world issues. From enabling secure remote workers to accelerating secure cloud adoption, defending against a pandemic of security attacks and beyond. CISO Talk covers the cyber topics you want to learn about. With your hosts, Unisys CISO Matt Newfield and MediaOps CEO Alan Schimmel, featuring a revolving panel of CISO cyber experts. This is where CISOs talk. Join us on digitalanarchist.com and techstrong.tv.
All right, we are back. Next up, we've got our Something Old segment. This is from last year's RSAC DevOps Connect virtual event. This one is a presentation by Nisha Kumar, who was a member of the technical staff too at VMware, and Alan Friedman, who was the director of cybersecurity initiatives at the NTIA Department of Commerce. They have a keynote presentation titled "What Are Clouds Made Of? SBOM and Code Transparency in Modern Applications." This is a really fascinating presentation about the importance of a software bill of materials in helping reduce the amount of cybersecurity incidents that occur, and kind of explaining the concept, a lot of the dependencies, their hierarchical relationships. It is a great presentation, a lot of how-tos and takeaways in this one. So let's go ahead and roll it now.
Hello, I'm Nisha Kumar, Senior Open Source Engineer at VMware, and I spend a lot of time thinking about clouds.
And I'm Alan Friedman, the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at NTIA in the US Department of Commerce. I spend a lot of time thinking about what things are made of. And so today, we're really excited to talk about what clouds are made of and how SBOM relates to cloud native and modern application development. So it's been a long day of talks so far. So I thought maybe we'll take a break and read some cartoons. Does that sound good? So I want to show two cartoons. First, perhaps many of you have seen this great XKCD from Randall Munroe that talks about how when we have our lovely, complex, and ornate modern digital infrastructure, buried deep underneath it might be sort of one weak link or one link that maybe isn't as strong or resilient as we might imagine. And so if we're going to address that, we need transparency. And a starting point of transparency is going to be knowing what we have in our supply chain. But I also want to highlight this great cartoon from Rob Lee and Jeff, which talks about the fact that transparency is important, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. So we don't want to overstate the impact. SBOM and what we're going to be talking about today is the starting point. We're going to need to have a lot more. And so today we're going to walk through the basics of SBOM and then highlight what might be coming next.
Okay, so today we will be going over some motivating examples for why you would need an SBOM. We make the case for software transparency and why we need that. We talk about why we're not doing these things today, and then we're going to go over some SBOM basics. And then how do we apply SBOMs to modern applications, and some ongoing work that's coming down the pipeline to make a more auditable supply chain. And then some ongoing work on SBOM itself and how you can get involved.
So let's start with a couple of stories. First, everyone's favorite thing, let's talk about a vulnerability. Now, this is a recently announced vulnerability. I change this slide every month or so because someone discovers something new. This is something that's buried deep in TCP/IP stacks that's used all over the embedded space in IoT and industrial systems, which we know are really at great risk. Now, the hard part of this should be the work that the security researchers do to find it. And then folks, of course, have to fix it. But what's always shocking to me is how hard it is for organizations to figure out, hey, do I even have this software? And I'd put it to you that surprisingly few companies or organizations on the entire planet, whether you make software or whether you use other people's software, could actually quickly and easily answer the question, am I potentially affected? And that's perhaps the biggest core aspect of transparency in the supply chain. And SBOM is just saying, hey, is this anywhere on my network? A slightly more nuanced story gets into how do we handle and respond to vulnerabilities. So this is a guy named Shlomi. He's the head of a small research firm called JSOF. Last year, they discovered a vulnerability called Ripple 20, which is also an embedded vulnerability. And he wanted to give his big fancy talk at Black Hat. Well deserved. But before he could do it, he wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to let vendors who might be affected know that they might be affected. But the problem is, today, we have no idea where some of these components are used or even how to reach the people that might be using them. So he and his team had to do OSINT. They had to scour LinkedIn looking for anyone who was bragging about having expertise in this particular software library, and then reach out to them and reach out to the company and say, hey, we think you might be affected. And by the way, this company in particular is a Fortune 100 company that has real impact in the world.
Let's take a look at a motivating example from the SaaS world. And as it so happens, one landed on our lap last month, the recent CodeCov breach. The long and short of the story is that an attacker was able to grab CodeCov's credentials by taking advantage of an error in the Docker image creation process and used it to modify its bash uploader script. Rather than go for the easy target of knocking CodeCov for not verifying the hash of the script, I would like you to consider this Docker image creation error. We're still not sure how exactly the Docker image was built, but we know that build arguments can be passed to the Docker build command line. And here I can speculate that some of those may have been the offending credentials. Either way, not auditing the supply chain resulted in thousands of customer secrets being compromised and some bad press for CodeCov. When you are a SaaS provider and your machinery is compromised, you go down hard.
So transparency is something that we have in the marketplace today. And in fact, those of you who have dabbled in economics know that it drives a proper market is when people actually know what they're getting. We see this in areas like safety data sheets in the chemical industry, or indeed the hardware bill of materials model, when before you can build something, you need to know what you have it. But let's take the example that a lot of folks know of just, food ingredient label. So you go to the store and you buy something, it comes with a list of ingredients. Hey, Nisha, you hungry?
I sure am.
All right, you want a Twinkie?
Oh, what's a Twinkie?
Well, it's a delicious, non-biodegradable treat. But we can take a look before you decide to figure out if you want it. So are you vegetarian, for example?
I'm not vegetarian, but I don't like beef.
Well, if we look into our list of ingredients, we find out that Twinkies contain tallow. Do you know what tallow is?
I don't. What's tallow?
Oh, we'll see. This is an important fact because the list of ingredients needs to also be processable. So tallow is beef fat, which means that Twinkies are not actually vegetarian. Now, for many of us, that's okay. We eat everything. If we're willing to eat the rest of the stuff in a Twinkie, we might be willing to eat the beef fat. But we all know people, and I have friends like Nisha, for whom that would be a big deal, or that would be something that they would want to avoid. And transparency here isn't about dictating what's good or bad. It's about allowing everyone to make the right risk-based decisions. And I'd put it to you even more strongly, you can't make good risk-based decisions unless you know what you have. Once we can actually have this layer of data, we can actually build on this and indeed start to make tools and have business models that help. So for example, CVE and numbering vulnerabilities doesn't magically fix them. You still have to do the work. But now that we have a way of tracking them, it has created tools and business models and organizational processes to move forward. We want to have the similar vision for SBOM. Transparency also helps us understand what's further up the supply chain. So what we want to do is really allow people to have visibility and start to say, hey, what am I actually using? We want to put a little natural selection into this. So there's a challenge in the software supply chain, in this open source world, is a very macabre problem known as the bus problem, where we say, hey, how many of the projects that I'm using are absolutely dependent on someone looking both ways before they cross the street every time? So we really need to understand what's in a lot of these packages that we're using.
So supply chains auditing using a bill of materials is not new. Other industries have been adopting supply chain discipline since Deming went to Japan to improve Toyota's car manufacturing process. Software as a profession has not considered enforcing discipline over their supply chain because it's not been this impactful. I think we are now in a place where Toyota once was, trying to improve their processes. What this discipline brings to software engineering is security and resiliency. So it's not just CVEs. It's also with SBOM, we have data that we can act on and make decisions with about things like compliance, maintainability, and usability.
So, for example, Nisha, if you're trying to pick between two similar projects for something that you're working on, and they're both roughly the same size and the same age, but one project has 3 CVEs against it, and the other project has never had a CVE, which one do you think would be the better choice?
Well, the ones that don't have the CVE, of course.
Well, I would have thought so too, because, hey, it doesn't have the security issues. But after talking to people who are experts in vulnerabilities, they'll be very quick to point out that having a CVE isn't a sign that the code's bad. All code, especially a large project, is going to have some flaws. What you want is a project that has management that can take the vulnerability information, announce the vulnerability, and fix the vulnerability. So if the projects are pretty similar and one has never had a CVE and the other one has, chances are the management of that second one is actually going to be a little bit better. And so you can rely on them. Just the visibility of management is something that you don't have if you don't have the view further up the supply chain. And ultimately, I think this comes down to the idea that if what you're using is a black box, would you actually trust the product or service that didn't have an SBOM? Even if they didn't want to share it with you, would you trust someone that said, hey, I don't have that information? Would you at least want them to show that they have the information? So if you like this and you're like, hey, Nisha, Al, this is a pretty good idea. Why aren't we already doing this? Well, there's important things to know, right? There's a little bit of history here. One is that licensing concerns and open source restrictions has traditionally made a lot of people, even some of the most sophisticated companies, a little gun shy, because a little secret, not everyone always followed the rules when it came to software licensing. I think that's a much better understood risk today. We have commercial off-the-shelf tools that help people manage it. The data is available. Every startup that I talk to these days knows that they're going to have to go through an open source audit whenever they reach exit. And we even have international standards like the Open Chain process that helps organizations manage their open source risk. Another challenge is that this isn't something that can be unilaterally driven. This is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. No one asks for the data, so no one provides it. No one provides it, so no one asks for it. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, is how we can prime that pump from a market perspective. But I also want to acknowledge that it's hard and complex. For this to really work and scale, we need to have enough of a shared view that it can be machine readable. And it's not just a technical issue. We're going to dive into some of the organizational and operational details as well.
From a cloud native perspective, the software bill of materials complexity grows exponentially. This is because the ingredients used to create the machinery is complex. Software components often have long dependency chains. NPM immediately comes to mind, but the fact of the matter is a lot of language ecosystems have long dependency chains. It's not the length of the chain that's the problem. It's that the tools do not collect enough metadata to reason about the dependency chain. Developers do not know what their software includes. For example, pip packages may contain precompiled binaries that are required for the Python application to run, but you would never know this because they don't show up when you list all the packages using pip freeze. The build systems are not reproducible and they're not hermetic, meaning they talk to the internet at build time, thus making the builds non-deterministic. Docker files are a good example of this paradigm. One can pull a pre-built container image based on a tag that may not exist in the future and install software from anywhere on the internet and deploy this container to a private registry. So what is included in this container is dependent on the state of the internet at the time of build. And there are a lot of unknown unknowns, things that are private PPAs, non-official package repositories, non-official registries, random URLs. And even though there are some canonical repositories that are vetted by the community, there are a lot of artifacts out there that are provided by people on Stack Overflow, for example.
So if this is something we need and we don't have, hey, that sounds like a job for your friends in the government. And in fact, for the last 3 years, NTIA, which is part of the US Department of Commerce, that's my office right there on the slide, has been working to bring together the entire software community to make some progress on the basics of SBOM. Now, our approach has been cross-sector. What we really didn't want is to have one way of doing things in the energy space and having the elite cloud native people do something completely different and having, the US government require it a third way. We all use the same software, so we need the same basics, and then we can move from there. It also has to be international. This isn't just, despite the flag, this isn't just an American issue. This is a global issue. Every so often, we remember that there are countries outside the US, and this is very important that we've been getting feedback from our friends around the world in participation. Next, we didn't want to build sort of the perfect ultimate solution because we knew that that would take too long and people wouldn't end up using it. We follow the mantra of crawl, then walk, then run, because we want to make it easy for people to get started. And then over time, we can advance and tackle the more sophisticated cases. We also wanted to try avoid inventing brand new standards. If we're trying to help people adopt things, the solution is to use what we already have rather than to create something new. It has to be modular so that we can slot it in with other efforts. And we want to harmonize these global efforts while still allowing flexibility, because different communities, both technical and different sectors, are going to have slightly different needs, regulations, requirements. We want to have the flexibility, but make sure that we're all building on the same structure, the same framework, because we're all using the same software. So let's start out with some of the basics. We've been talking about SBOM now for a while. What the heck's an SBOM? This is a very, very simple illustration of what we're talking about. In our toy example here, Acme application has exactly two dependencies, Bingo Buffer and Bob's Browser. Bob's Browser in turn depends on Carol's compression engine. Now, a couple of things to note here. For each of these components, we might want a lot of data, but the minimum we need isn't that much. What's the supplier, right? What component or repo did this come from? What's the component name? What's the version so that we know if it's up to date or outdated or vulnerable? What's the hash so that Nisha can feel confident that when I'm using a piece of software, it's the legitimate one that we both recognize as canonical rather than something that I've downloaded from a potentially backdoored site. And then what's the author of this data? Did this come from me, the developer? Did it come from an upstream source? Did it come from a security tool? The last thing I want to flag here is the explicit acknowledgement of known unknowns, because we know that not everyone's going to have all the data right off the bat. Certain people will be easier for others. Some of the code is proprietary, so you may not have all the data. In this case, we have no idea if Bingo Buffer has dependencies or not. It may not, but it also may be the top of a very dark tree. By saying we don't know, whoever gets this data can make the appropriate decision. They can say, that's not good enough, give me data. They can do their own risk analysis, or they can say, you know what, that's fine. I'm not worried about the risks here. The important thing is that we're empowering people to make those decisions. Now, how are we going to implement this? We didn't want to create a brand new standard. And the good news is that there are some data formats that can convey this already. The three that the community has settled on as the consensus SBOM standards are SPDX, CycloneDX, and SWID. SPDX comes out of the Linux Foundation. It's originally developed for licensing, but it has since expanded to cover lots of use cases, especially for security. CycloneDX is relatively new, comes out of the OWASP world, and it's purpose-built for dependency and is collaborating with other OWASP efforts. SWID tags are the oldest of them. It was originally developed for license management in the commercial space, and it has the advantage of being an ISO standard. These are all great specs, and what we as a community have done have basically said, let's think about how to interoperate. We've identified the common elements, and we don't think that a multilingual ecosystem will pose too many challenges. And so it's not our job to pick a winner or a loser. We want to promote all of them. And participants in all of these have recognized the value of collaborating together. And so here are the common fields that you can easily translate between them. Once you have the data fields, it's pretty straightforward for computers to do the job. And in fact, there are translation tools already available today.
So what about SBOMs for SaaS providers? Do they even need to provide one? Maybe not. It depends on the customer. It is easy to assume that it's not required as no software actually gets shipped. However, consider that service providers do take custody of the customer's software and provide all the machinery to deploy it. So with great power comes great responsibility. Customers don't really care about the background machinery that providers use, but they do expect that their assets be secured and auditable. And they care about the risk they will be taking by entrusting a significant amount of the business operations to the service provider. So the question a service provider has to ask today is, do you know what you built? Do you know all the cogs in your machinery? You don't need to provide one to your customer, maybe not, depends on the customer, but you do need it for yourself in order to audit your software supply chain. Okay, so at this point, I will tell you not to worry because we can approach this problem by crawling first. So let's crawl. Most of the pieces used to build cloud-native applications are built using containers. Most cloud workloads are containers. Most cloud infrastructure components are containers. All cloud-native applications are containers. If we can create an SBOM for a container, we are off to a good start. But in order to do that, we need to take a step back first to understand what is a container. Now, containers are just Linux processes forked in their own namespace and with their own resource constraints. We're not going to look at that here. We're going to be looking at container images. These are essentially stripped down Linux file systems broken down into a series of tar archives. This is what a static analyzer that targets container images will analyze. Let's take a look. So you can imagine a container image as a many-layered parfait. The bottommost layer is a Linux file system, which provides some basic configuration and tools. You can use the tools to install system dependencies that are required for your app to work. That makes up the next layer. Then the app dependencies are installed on top of that, and that would make up a few more layers. And then finally, you would add your application at the top, and that would be the next layers. Now, this isn't by design. This is how software installation typically happens on Linux distros. And the layers are just the result of the file system snapshotter that's used by the container build tools, such as Docker. So here are some examples of layered containers in the wild. Docker's official images are layered in this way. They do this because they have to support a variety of Linux distros and app ecosystems. Bitnami's images are well-regulated, and they come from a well-regulated container build pipeline. And these are actually one of the images you can find in SBOM in the container file system. That's how Bitnami has engineered their pipeline. Cloud-native build packs and their Go implementation, which is the Keto build packs, use the build pack specification to maintain a separation between the system and app dependencies. And this allows you to update the layers independently, which is pretty cool. You can get an SBOM for these kind of containers using the pack command line tool. One thing they all have in common is that there is some level of scrutiny and control over what goes into a container build. So you can generate an SBOM reasonably well for these images. But not all images are like this. But at least you'll be able to figure out what are your known knowns and what are your known unknowns. The kind of container images that keep me up at night are the ones that I like to call the smoothie. They are heavily processed container images, and they are the result of a multi-stage Docker build and processes used to shrink the number of files in the container image and reduce its file size, tools like Docker Slim. This is actually a best practice for runtime security because you reduce your attack surface. However, it's difficult to understand what exactly you are running as all the metadata in the container image is gone. You can typically find these container images for applications built with Go. Go binaries are statically compiled. What this means is that what finally ends up in the container image is an opaque binary blob. You would be lucky to be able to find a list of GitHub projects that were involved in the creation of the blob, but you would be hard-pressed to find the exact source code. Here's an example of a Kubernetes container. So this is the container autoscaler, the cluster autoscaler, sorry, which has one layer, which is the slimmed down distroless OS, and the binary blob on top of it, which is the cluster autoscaler. And this is what your static analyzer will find. Some static analyzers will be able to read the strings, and they'll find a list of GitHub URLs that went into building this binary blob, but not the actual source code. And this may be reasonable if the release machinery was deterministic. Kubernetes SIG release team have done great work in making this process more deterministic. Kudos to them. But in general, not much information about the build is transferred to the container image. Tracing back to source code is non-trivial. You will just have to trust the organization that built this. More seriously, though, if the build is not repeatable, that is, you can't recreate that container image from the same tagged release on GitHub, you're stuck with a stale container image. And these do exist in the ecosystem. All right, so having said all these, what tools are available that you can use right now to build and generate SBOMs for container images today? There are three tools I'd like to highlight. OWASP's dependency track tool will list the source code dependencies, and it also supports importing SBOMs in the CycloneDX and SPDX formats. Turn, which, full disclosure, is a project I maintain, finds package metadata and container images built with Docker, and if you're using Docker files. And they generate SBOMs in the SPDX format. And the last one I'd like to highlight is Ssf, which is a tool built by Anchor. And it finds package metadata and container images, and then generates SBOMs for container images in the CycloneDX format. And it also has support for another tool that has vulnerability analysis called Gripe, which is also built by Anchor. Now, don't get too excited, because this is actually not enough to provide software transparency for the whole supply chain. This is just a starting point. If you want to have a more auditable supply chain, you need to have SBOMs for the components that you include in your software factory. Things like the build tool chains, for example, the compiler that was used to create the binary, build stages, all the containers that go into CI/CD pipelines, configuration, what kind of environment variables you set in your larger environment, and what you pass to the build. Secrets management, there really isn't any work going into how secrets can be passed between containers and into build environments. Signatures, where do you store them? How do you manage them? Where do you update them? And attestations for each stage in the build, and the verification of those attestations.
So while there's a lot that we're looking forward to build in the future, there's still some engineering problems we're trying to make sure that we can handle for things to be able to scale today. So, for example, naming is actually a non-trivial problem. In some cases, it's fairly straightforward, right? If all of your work happens in the domain of a package manager, then you're great. A lot of the value of a package manager is it creates a localized namespace. But we don't have a global namespace for software. You know, do we use com.sum.java or com.oracle.java? Well, it just depends on when you started keeping your records. So there's some advice that the SBOM community has published that basically amounts to, dear God, never invent your own name string to describe a piece of software. Let's use other things that are there and use an established naming format. Package URL is one of the more popular ones. There's also a project in Europe called Software Heritage ID, which is trying to solve a similar problem. If we are interested in providing SBOMs downstream, how do we actually deliver them? In some cases, it'll be fairly straightforward. If we're dealing with open source, then just keep the metadata in the repo. If you're dealing with shipped on-prem software, well, then we can say, hey, you know what? Just put the metadata next to your blob. If we're dealing in a SaaS environment, we actually need to be a little bit creative about this. And we've broken the issue down into discovery. How do I let the user know that it's there? And then access, because maybe I'm only willing to let certain people access this, or certain customers or certain licensees to access it, rather than make it public. And so we want to be able to use existing access control streams as well. And by the way, for embedded systems, it's even harder when we talk to folks who are in operational technology or healthcare. Well, then they say, hey, I need the data to can't follow the device because I'm not going to let my scanner on these non-IT networks. So we're working on some great solutions in that front as well. And the last challenge I want to flag is the idea that not all vulnerabilities are actually put users at risk. In fact, if you go by some metrics from some vendors and some experts, it's a very low percentage, below 10%. And so what we need to do is acknowledge that, because as more people start tracking this data, it's going to increase the number of false positives. And what we want to do, because we acknowledge that security resources are quite scarce, is to make sure we can prioritize what we should be paying attention to. Even when it comes to things like code refactoring, we have a priority list of which we want to adjust first. So one of the things we're building into the supply chain is the ability for a project or a product to communicate downstream, this vulnerability does not affect me. I am asserting that. So if you trust that, if an open source project says, hey, we use this component that's got a vulnerability in it, but it doesn't affect us, and we've done the legwork. If you trust the maintainers of that project, you can then say, okay, this is safe to ignore, and then you can communicate that downstream to your customers. We're using this on an Oasis project called the Common Security Advisory Framework, and we're calling this, not the greatest name, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, or VEX. So I want to close by trying to underscore a point that SBOM is coming. We're seeing a lot of government activity and interest in this. Started in medical devices. The regulator in the United States for medical devices has basically said we're going to be requiring this for new medical devices. Many medical devices have cloud or SaaS components, and they're also worrying about that. We're seeing this spill over into other areas, into automotive and energy and electricity. We're also seeing this coming in more and more standards and guidance. So, for example, here are two standards that have been issued by ENISA in Europe. One of them is for IoT devices, but even more noteworthy is the standard on the bottom applies to cloud service providers. And one of the things it asks is, hey, can you track this? But a substantial level is, do you have a formal SBOM? More generally, I think we're going to see more people starting to ask for this. So, for example, in the electricity marketplace, the Edison Electric Institute, which is a trade association of publicly traded utilities, has started to introduce guidance for their members to say, hey, whenever you buy something, ask for an SBOM. We're going to see more and more people asking you about this. And as we talked about, we want to make sure that you're empowered to give them an answer. Even if it's not, I will give you one, you should be able to say, I have one. And then lastly, how does SBOM fit in with a lot of the other efforts? Nisha highlighted a bunch of different related projects that we're seeing across the ecosystem that are pulling in more data. SBOM is going to be part of that. It's not going to be the whole solution, but it is, going back to our grocery store analogy, it's part of that healthy breakfast. So where are we today? Some organizations, starting to creep into many organizations, can already produce at least partial SBOMs. And this includes folks from a different range of actors. It really is just a matter of a lot of these organizations have the good hygiene today. So you can think of this as a hygiene approach. The goal of this broader SBOM effort, which is bringing together different approaches, both inside NTIA and in parallel efforts, is one, let's make SBOM generation easier and cheaper and more scalable. So what can we do? What are the obstacles that you have to do this today? How do we help with that? Two is we just want to spread the word. We want to make sure that there's an expectation in the marketplace, because that's really what's going to drive it. And then lastly, we're not interested in transparency for its own sake. We want to make sure the data is useful and can actually help people verify that they've got good security and make good risk-based decisions. Moving forward, we're going to need your help. This needs continued industry leadership and expertise to guide investment and standards and practices and public policy around the world. So we hope you'll reach out. There's some fun resources that are available, including something that Nisha just was talking about.
The CNCF's Security Supply Chain Technical Advisory Group is doing a lot of work in this space, including their list of supply chain compromises that you can take a look at. They've got a whole list of supply chain compromises dating back to 2003. You can get an idea of how the compromises happen and what you may be able to do in order to prevent those. They have a talk that they gave at KubeCon EU just recently, a couple of months back, that's called How to Prevent CNCF Gate. You can, there's a link to that in the slides over here. And watch out for a software supply chain white paper that the CNCF is working on and will be publishing soon.
So if you're interested in some of the cross-cutting basics around SBOM, I encourage you to go to ntia.gov/SBOM. That has a set of resources that will help you depending on what level you're interested in. There are some introductory approaches, including some things that are aimed at helping executives understand it. There's an SBOM at a glance paper. There's an FAQ that can walk through some of the common questions. For example, Nisha, do you think SBOMs help attackers?
I don't know. Do they help attackers?
We don't think they do, because we think advanced adversaries don't need it because they can find this information out. And adversaries that are using automated attack tools don't care about your SBOM. They're just using automated scanning tools. So rather, we think of an SBOM as a roadmap to the defender rather than a roadmap to the attacker. If you're interested in getting involved in this global SBOM process, go to ntia.gov/software transparency, where you'll find a lot of information, including some of our past meetings and presentations, but also information on how to get involved in some of the working groups. There are folks thinking about this from an architectural level, and how do we reconcile SBOM with some of the more advanced tools that Nisha's been talking about. There are folks explicitly focusing on tools. So how do we, and how do we implement this in the data formats of SPDX, CycloneDX, and SWID? And of course, there's another working group that's just focusing on awareness and adoption, how to get this out. We also have proofs of concept work happening in different sectors today. So we have some work happening in the healthcare sector, not necessarily one of the vanguards of cybersecurity, but they're leading the way on this. The automotive sector and the electricity sector have also been making a lot of progress to show that this is possible. So if you want to get involved, there's some resources, or you can reach out directly to me, and I'll talk to you more about SBOM, probably far more than you want me to.
And if you have any questions about tools and processes and what tools are out there and what the actual folks who are deep down in the DevOps weeds like I am are working on, and problems that we're trying to solve and need help on, you can reach out to me. My handle is @NishaKahmad on Twitter. And with that, thank you for watching. I'm Nisha Kumar.
And I've been Alan Friedman.
Hey, everybody. Happy Tuesday. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm here now with the headlines. First up on DevOps.com is an article that offers 4 ways organizations can up-level their software engineering teams in 2022. As we enter the new year, it's clear that successful businesses will be those that build with constant change in mind, backed by effective, fast-moving software teams. This is the year organizations must focus on fine-tuning its DevOps processes and up-level its teams. But where to start? This article explains the 4 biggest ways in which an organization can begin to transform its teams into engineering powerhouses, no matter how big or small or where they are in the world. In the new year, software developers will be of critical importance as organizations continue to expand on digital services and projects. Embracing new methods of software delivery, prioritizing people and culture, and keeping an eye on how to best leverage automation tools like low-code and no-code and change validation will all help an organization to transform its team for the better in 2022. This forward-looking approach and a willingness to reassess and pivot guarantees that the software engineering team will remain agile amidst a rapidly changing tech landscape. And we look at application security and the critical role of developers and the right tools in building secure software. DevOps culture and rapid cloud adoption mean developers are shipping code faster than ever, and in many cases, security teams are struggling to keep up. To avoid relegating security to afterthought status, organizations must shift left and adopt a developer-first approach to application security. Organizations that depend on software development need a solution that accomplishes 2 essential things to adapt and survive: risk-appropriate security measures and an even distribution of functions across the stack. Just as the entire development process starts with developers, integrating security should also start with a developer-first approach. Developer-first application security is the future, and this article shows us how organizations can evaluate tools that will help them adopt a developer-first approach. Okay, in news, WhiteSource has added the Microsoft Azure DevOps platform to the list of CI/CD platforms its open-source vulnerability scanning tools natively supports. The company also has a merge confidence feature that uses crowdsourced data to show how likely it is that an open-source component can be updated without breaking the build. Merge confidence includes data on upgrade age, adoption, and compatibility to create a confidence score. The white source integrations make it possible for DevOps teams to detect all open source components being used and automatically enforce security policies directly from their repository. DevOps teams are provided with vulnerability and misconfiguration alerts and license violations, along with detailed remediation guidance, including suggested fixes and prioritization advice within an existing workflow. That saves teams from having to switch to a tool that has a separate user interface that they need to learn. Should a merge request introduce a new error, the developer is given immediate feedback to resolve any newly introduced vulnerabilities before the request is completed. That approach to separating feature branches and mainline branches prevents interruptions to workflows. WhiteSource also supports code repositories including GitHub, GitHub Packages, JFrog, Bitbucket, and GitLab. All right, over on Container Journal, we have the results of a survey from Buoyant that shows more than a quarter of organizations have already swapped out the service mesh platform they initially adopted. Among those that have switched, 80% had been using open source Istio for Kubernetes, now being advanced by Google. Buoyant is the developer of the open source Linkerd service mesh. Nearly 2/3 of respondents say they have yet to deploy a service mesh in a production environment. Another 14% say they have been using one in a production environment for fewer than 6 months. And the top reason respondents give for employing a service mesh does not appear to have much to do with managing APIs in a cloud-native environment. Instead, 58% of respondents cite the need for end-to-end encryption. Survey respondents identified ease of use and installation, the extent of feature set, simplicity, and resource consumption as the top criteria they consider for implementing a service mesh. All right, over on Security Boulevard, we look at some cybersecurity considerations for Web 3. We've begun a major shift in how the internet is structured. The current Web 2, which is defined by a read-write architecture that until recently was dominated by a handful of massive technology companies, is giving way to the next iteration of the internet, Web 3. Unlike its predecessor, Web 3 reflects a more decentralized internet, where users and the community are in control instead of centralized companies. Its rise is as much a result of the natural evolution of technology as it is the growing anti-big tech sentiment and doubts around big tech's ability to create equitable platforms that act in the best interest of their communities. Web3's foundation is blockchain-based technology leveraged for trust verification and includes privacy protection, decentralized infrastructure, and application platforms and decentralized identities. This is a revolutionary step that will enable users, creators, and developers to hold greater stakes and the ability to vote on a platform in much the way a cooperative works. But this deeper connection will come at a price that cybersecurity professionals must take into consideration. This article delves into some of the security issues that have the potential to plague Web 3 and what organizations can do now to protect themselves. And finally, we have an article that discusses how to add data privacy to DevSecOps. The spate of data privacy laws that have been passed in various states in the United States and regions outside the United States make it clear that data privacy has become incredibly important within cybersecurity, and that includes within the DevSecOps process. It's been enough of a challenge to integrate security into the DevOps process at all, even though now it is recognized that adding security early in the software development lifecycle can eliminate issues further along in application development and deployment. But is adding data privacy really necessary? Yes. Yes, it is. Putting a greater emphasis on privacy within DevSecOps requires two things: data privacy protocols already in place within the organization, and a strong commitment to the integration of cybersecurity with data privacy. This article looks at ways in which organizations can adjust their DevSecOps processes to include data privacy without slowing down or interrupting the software development lifecycle. All right, that's it for the headlines. I'll be back on Thursday with a brand new batch for you. Until then, I hope everybody has a great day, and please, whatever you do, stay safe.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Techstrong TV. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm here now with Lisa Plagemeyer, who is the Executive Director for the National Cybersecurity Alliance. Lisa, thank you so much for taking a few minutes and talking with me today. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet, you bet. So I think we're a little behind the ball because by the time this runs, Data Privacy Week will be over. But let's talk about Data Privacy Week and some of the things that you're seeing in your position as Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance. You guys are seeing a whole bunch of stuff, I know for sure. But I'm interested in talking with you specifically about maybe some of the things that you guys are seeing as it relates to cybersecurity trends for 2022, and some of the things that maybe you've seen over the last 12 months or so as the it seems like 2022 or 2021 in particular was a very tumultuous year for cybersecurity and affecting a lot of changes both on the corporate level and the governmental level. So I'm interested in kind of getting your thoughts on what's been happening and what we might see in 2022. But first, I want to give you congratulations because I know your predecessor, Kelvin Coleman, who has since moved on to IBM. So want to congratulate you for taking the helm over at the Cybersecurity Alliance. I think it's a great organization, and certainly you guys are doing great things. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Calvin's shoes are hard to fill. He's a great guy. It's an organization I've been on the board with for a few years before I was in this role, and I've always believed really strongly in the mission of the organization.
That's great.
Yeah, so it's a privilege, honestly.
Excellent.
Yeah. As far as what we're seeing and the kinds of predictions we're making for 2022, I think that consumer sentiment is shifting a little bit. You know, the days of shock and awe with cybersecurity scary stories are over, I think. You know, the Target, Equifax, Yahoo, name a giant breach that hit the TV headlines. And the typical sort of reporting would be the big shock and awe, you know, if it bleeds, it leads kind of headline. Mm-hmm. And maybe at some point, a very smart security talking head saying a lot of things that the average person can't understand about what it was that just happened. And your average consumer is just left with this feeling of, you know, somehow I got hosed and I'm not even quite sure what happened. All I know is that my social security number is out there somewhere, or a bad guy has my username and password. And I don't know what happened. I don't understand anything about it. I'm maybe a little bit angry or a lot angry. And, you know, maybe I'll end up with some credit monitoring, and that's about it. And you know, another few weeks goes by and there's another headline. So I think now there's more and more of an appetite on behalf of consumers to do more to protect themselves and to want to understand what's actually happening in layman's terms, as opposed to the shock and awe headlines. When it comes to, I'll take the security side first, right? We haven't done enough, I don't think, in the industry to really explain things in terms that people can understand. And we did a report earlier this year at the National Cybersecurity Alliance, together with a company called Cybersecurity out of the UK. The report is called Oh Behave, and people can find it on our website, staysafeonline.org. We asked people about their attitudes and beliefs about security. And we asked them if they found security intimidating, if they found it frustrating. And not surprisingly, the answers to both of those were by and large yes. And I think if you think about, you know, the images of the hackers and the hoodies on the nightly news, and the words that we use, like threats and attacks and defenses and all this militaristic language that the average person can't relate to, it's no wonder that people find this stuff frustrating and, a little scary and intimidating. Mm-hmm. And then you layer onto that some of the complex terms like multi-factor authentication, which should have a more consumer-friendly name because it's a consumer-facing thing, right? We're asking consumers to use it. So I don't think we've done ourselves any favors in that sense. And I do think there's more of an appetite out there for people to just, give me the bottom line, like tell me what's really going on here. What do I need to look for in the companies I do business with? What can I do about it myself? And don't give me 20 pieces of advice. Just give me a couple that I can actually turn around and implement. And then likewise on the privacy side of the house, I think there's more and more appetite for people to have just better visibility and better control over their own data. We had, as part of Data Privacy Week, we had a LinkedIn Live event, 3-hour event, and which is available recorded on our site and on LinkedIn. And there were quite a few data privacy folks on there saying that they can, and actually a speaker from Consumer Reports saying that according to their research, they can see a time not too far in the distance where a consumer will pay more for privacy. They'll actually pay more to have more control over their data. So whether it's tools that give them that control, or maybe saying no to sharing all their information, paying for an application as opposed to getting free email when really all your data is the price that you're paying for that free service. So those are two of the things that we're looking at for this year.
I've heard about the paying more for privacy, which I think is a great thing. There to me, there seems to be a kind of a level, maybe a low level of apathy that still exists a lot with consumers when they're talking about cybersecurity, because there is this big unknown, and because we've all been barraged with the headlines for the last 2+ years about one data breach after another. And yes, you get free credit monitoring, but by the way, your social security number is all over the dark web, and it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So I think people have just been kind of beaten down by the constant threat, if you will. And so I think they just kind of give up after a while. And so the idea of now having to pay more for something that should be inherent in security, in online practices, at least in their minds, I wonder, when we say they're willing to pay more, how much more do you think they're willing to pay before they say, wait a minute, this should not be on me to keep my data protected, my personal information protected. You want to do business with me, you want this information from me in order to do business, then it's up to you to protect that information, not me. So where do you think consumer sentiment is going in that respect?
Well, somewhere in that mix is going to be people looking to the federal government for more legislation. I think if you're in California or one of the states that has data privacy protections already in place, or you're in a state that's looking at doing that, I think at some point folks start to look at Congress and say, where's some legislation around this that is consistent across all 50 states rather than being dependent on which state in the country that I live in. I had the great fortune to live in Germany for 13 years. And of course, they have a history of an evil regime tracking its citizens, for some really awful purposes. And so they have some of the strongest data protection laws in the world. And I have to tell you, being a consumer there, it was really nice to not get robocalls, not get junk mail, not get, spam phone calls every night while you're trying to eat dinner with your family. They just don't have that kind of information available. companies aren't able to use that information in the same ways that companies can here. So I know we talk a lot about, as consumers, we want personalization, we want convenience, all those things. We don't want to slow down innovation. But there's a middle ground. It doesn't have to be the wild, wild west,
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if the companies that that are advancing all these new technologies, they're telling us that we want to have personalization, and they're telling us that we want to have a level of convenience that we don't currently have, because I firmly believe you don't miss what you don't have, right? You don't miss what you've never had. So you're telling me about this great new technology, but your data is going to be possibly breached and privacy is going to go out the window. But hey, you'll get customized emails and things like that. It's like, is it worth it at the end?
Is
it
worth the trade-off? So, yeah, I think the pendulum is starting to swing for sure.
Yeah. So, well, from a technology standpoint, then, to that end, are there certain things that you guys are seeing as far as, some of the ways that companies are stepping in from a technology standpoint to help us, just kind of quell the chaos or control the chaos?
Yeah. So I'm not a super technical person, but I can tell you, we're really about raising awareness and changing end user behavior at the National Cybersecurity Alliance. And so one of the cohorts for a lot of the materials we put out are the people doing training and awareness programs out there, both in security and privacy. And I am seeing, I just talked to a Fortune 10 company this morning that is going to be doing some PSAs, some short training videos, and actually going to spend money on the media buy to get those out in front of the American public. If you think about just in the awareness space, just thinking about, who's doing what as far as trying to educate their customer base or the American public. You've got Apple has done a lot of ads on privacy this year. Facebook is doing ads asking, saying, please legislate. And then you've had other, Microsoft has added free security training for their Microsoft Office customers. There's just a lot more being done at the awareness level, just trying to raise awareness and influence people's behavior. I would like to see, I'm a big proponent for us adding a carrot instead of a stick to those messages. So along the lines of, our conversation earlier about pictures of hackers and hoodies, using all that FUD, all that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the militaristic language, all those things can be so alienating to so many people. And it just causes a fight or flight response, right? Like, I just want to run away from this stuff. I don't want to engage, to your point about breach apathy or breach fatigue, both of which have been researched and documented. Those are really things. I think that if we want people to engage with something, we need to use a little bit of marketing language. And I heard Bruce Schneier talk about this at a virtual event lately. We should be saying it's quick. We should be saying it's easy. We should be saying it's simple. If you think about something like a password manager, our research showed that of the people who do not use password managers, which is a lot of people, the most popular answer for how do you manage all your passwords was I write them down in a notebook, much to our chagrin. So when you ask people about password managers, why they don't use them, they say, because I don't trust the password manager companies. And that's just I think that's leftover bad publicity from the early days of password managers when a few of them did have security incidents. And then a lack of understanding of how password managers work. So if we can clean up that misperception with some positivity around not, fear of the hacker in the hoodie and somebody breaking into an account, or your password's already out there for sale on the dark web. Right. But rather, once you do this, you'll feel so much better. Once you get all your passwords in this tool, and just the perception of these things being quick and easy. Most people think that to start using a password manager, it's going to eat up a whole Saturday afternoon, right? I'd rather be watching my favorite sports team and not setting this thing up all day. And the reality is that, you install it on your browser, you put a few things in there, maybe your most important financial services accounts. And then after that, you just let it run and do its thing. And it will ask you if you want to add every site that you visit. So it is really quick and easy. And it can think up a long, complex password to meet any rule you could possibly come up with a lot faster than I can. But, instead of telling people this is quick and easy and you'll feel peace of mind once you have it done, a lot of very well-intentioned security professionals would rather tell people, your data is for sale on the dark web and, try and scare you into taking action. And I think we need to lean into positivity.
I think you're right. And to your point, the password managers, I will attest, I love my password manager. I change my passwords a lot more frequently than I probably would otherwise, because it prompts me and it does, help me improve my security posture overall. So I highly recommend using password managers. And I've suggested to people and they all say, so there you go. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So Lisa, I know we could continue this conversation for at least another hour, but unfortunately that's all the time we have. So I do want to thank you very much for being on, and I sure hope you'll come back and have future conversations with me.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me.
All right, great. Thank you. I appreciate your time. All right, everybody, please stick around. We've got lots more Techstrong TV coming up, so stay tuned. Hey, everybody. Happy Tuesday. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm here now with a webinars preview. I always tell you we have so many great webinars coming up on DevOps.com, Container Journal, and Security Boulevard. Got 3 here for you that I hope you can join us at. They are coming up soon, so please mark your calendar. The first one is called 5 Things We Learned Not to Ignore While Scaling Kubernetes. This one is happening Wednesday, tomorrow, February 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern on DevOps.com. This is sponsored by Commodore. If your organization is using Kubernetes for orchestration, you've probably experienced 1 or 2 curveballs just when you think you've finally mastered the art of container management. And those curveballs usually come at you when you try to scale up. So how can you scale Kubernetes without striking out due to speed and reliability, not to mention sanity issues? This webinar will cover some of the hard lessons of Kubernetes, including the phantom challenges of working with Kubernetes, some 5 key factors you can't ignore when scaling Kubernetes, and best practices and tools for a smooth running Kubernetes system. Good stuff there. All right, the second one is called Uniting DevSecOps, Fact or Fiction. This one is also happening Wednesday, tomorrow, February 9th. This one is at 1 p.m. Eastern on DevOps.com. This one is sponsored by Fairwinds. The cloud native industry as a whole discusses the benefits of DevSecOps at length. But is DevSecOps possible? Can there truly be alignment between the pace of development, security, and ops? Well, this webinar focuses on the importance of DevSecOps in Kubernetes and how it can be achieved. By posing some facts and fiction statements, you'll be entertained and informed. Such fact and fiction statements such as fact, dev, and security can be aligned. Fiction, you'll never achieve true DevSecOps. And fact, don't rely on default anything. Truer words were never spoken. All right, the third webinar is called Protect and Backup Containerized Apps in a Multi-Cluster Environment. This one is happening Wednesday, tomorrow, February 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern on DevOps.com. It's going to be a busy day tomorrow. This one is sponsored by Twilio. Container and Kubernetes-based applications are on the rise, but many IT professionals delay rolling them out due to concerns related to data management and protection. In today's cloud-native world, enterprises need to ensure data resiliency across their multi-cloud infrastructure. In this webinar, attendees will learn how Twilio works with SUSE Rancher to improve backup, recovery, and migration of applications across multiple clusters, as well as cross-cluster recovery and portability of applications based on native capture of namespace, Helm, operators, and labels, and disaster recovery planning and execution. Another good one there. All right, that's it for the webinar's preview. Please check back with me on Thursday when I will have a fresh new batch for you. Until then, I hope everybody has a great day, and please, whatever you do, stay safe.
DevOps.com is the #1 online destination for DevOps education and community building. DevOps.com covers all aspects of DevOps, including DevOps best practices and tools, DevOps culture, DevSecOps, business impact, continuous testing, continuous delivery, and more. DevOps.com has the largest collection of original DevOps content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.devops.com to learn more. DevOps.com, where the world meets DevOps.
All right, welcome back. We've got one more for you today. We've got The View with Vizard. In this one, Mike Vizard speaks with GearSet CEO Kevin Boyle, and they talk about how low-code Salesforce platforms are going to expand the DevOps community in 2022. Indeed. That's a great presentation, great conversation. Let's go ahead and roll it now.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey guys, thanks for the throw. We're here with Kevin Boyle, who is the CEO for GearSet. They are specialists in DevOps in Salesforce environments. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Very nice to meet you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
We hear a lot about DevOps being a cultural challenge all the time, and we're starting to see more folks get involved in DevOps because of low code. But I'm wondering, to what degree is it really a technical challenge versus a cultural challenge these days? What's the mix of that issue? Because I feel like we've been talking about it for a decade. So are things going to change in 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I suppose the complicated answer is it's always a little bit of everything. I think culture is the thing that people often underestimate because tooling's so readily available. There's awesome products out there to help you, go on that DevOps journey from your first dipping your toe into the water up until, very complex orchestration pipelines and things. So because all of that technology and tooling exists, you sort of go in a little bit naive at times maybe and just confident that you can apply technology to the problem solely. But of course, the truth is that culturally, culture plays just as big a part, or if potentially even a bigger part. You have to understand what your team is actually trying to get out of it, what your organization is actually trying to get out of it, and then apply tooling to the problem appropriately. If you think about what DevOps really was started as, a decade ago, as you say, or even before it had that nice tagline, it was about breaking down the barriers between, the folks that were writing code, or the folks that were speccing code, or the folks that were releasing the product to the market, whatever it was. It was getting all of those different stakeholders together and making sure that they understood they were part of a single coherent process. And that still continues, and that's often the part that's overlooked when people say they're going to bring in DevOps. They very often forget that they're going to have to change their teams along the way.
It's part of the challenge too now that we're bringing in people who are using low-code tools, and there's a wide range of folks. We see professional developers using low-code tools to accelerate development, but we're also seeing more, junior class developers, and in some cases, citizen developers. And we need to find a way to bring them into a DevOps workflow. So do I need to create kind of different levels of experiences for those folks?
I think it's a recognition that all of these folks are stakeholders in how your business is going to be powered going forward, and how technology is going to be applied to your business through that digital transformation. If you sort of think about that quote, the software is eating the world one, that's just getting truer and truer and truer. And what low code provides uniquely is it's inclusive in a way that perhaps other platforms haven't been. So you can get folks that are much closer to the business, business analysts, or in the case of our specialty is Salesforce, teams of Salesforce professionals, developers, admins, release managers. Some of them come from software engineering backgrounds, some of them don't. Some of them come through either a Salesforce bespoke route or a BA route. And what those really powerful low-code platforms do is allow all of those folks to take part in building the software and technology that's going to power your business. And because it's mapping out your business, it's going to be as complex as your business is. And that's really going to require then all of the same reasons you would have DevOps for Java or C# or Node is equally true of those low code platforms. You want to be able to properly understand why you're making the change. You want to be able to properly understand, is the change that you've actually made address the actual request that came from the business, and then track it through, from development through to testing and UAT and production and monitoring and getting that nice feedback, the feedback loop, all that nice infinity swirl stuff. All of that's as true for low code platforms as anything else. The interesting challenge for low code platforms, as you nicely articulated there, is because it is more inclusive and the background of these folks is a little bit more diverse. Some things that you might take for granted on C# or Java are new to some people working on these platforms. Things like version control, continuous integration, robust unit testing and regression testing. Some of these concepts are new, and you just have to make sure that you're applying both that cultural change and the technology change in a way that brings everyone along for the ride.
Do you think that the overall size of the DevOps community is expanding because we are seeing people drive digital business transformation initiatives off of Salesforce platforms? There's a lot of integration, and it's just not a thing you turn on and go. It requires a certain amount of customization, but is that, as a result, pulling more people into the DevOps orbit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the DevOps sphere is increasing in size because software is increasing in size, because our businesses are, I know we're sort of 20, 30 years into a digital revolution, but it is still more and more businesses have more and more of their components powered by software. And what those low code platforms do is allow, many more stakeholders that understand the business, even better than software engineers might have done in the past, to take part in building that. So because you've increased the number of developers, the number of folks that are building out software. So you've increased the sort of magnitude of the problem anyway, and the systems then that are required for managing that change. And then the other thing that I think that low code platforms really allow for is that pace of change as well. So the pace of change on top of Salesforce, the teams that we work with, the teams that the Salesforce teams that have really embraced DevOps are getting releases out every day, every few hours. That rate of change can only really be managed when you bring in a nice DevOps process. You can obviously have that rate of change without the DevOps process, but yeah, you're probably gonna be spinning your wheels a little bit more.
Do you think people are underestimating the rate at which low-code applications will be built, and therefore they're not quite prepared for the delivery side of that cycle, and we might see some bottlenecks emerge?
Yeah, potentially. I guess I'm a little bit biased just because I'm so in that world. So I think if you're in the world of low-code and Salesforce and the other low-code platforms, you absolutely see this groundswell just change of who really is building the software that's powering businesses. So if you're in that world, yeah, you see it. But we do a State of Salesforce DevOps report every year. Last year, we saw that I think it was like 35% of teams had planned to adopt CI this year without first having adopted source control. So I think we're still in the infancy of it. So I think even for the teams that are really in this world, they still potentially don't know what's just quite in front of them.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking the question a little bit because I would argue we've never really mastered the CD side of the CI/CD equation anyway. Everybody's kind of done the CI bit, but the CD part remains challenging, and maybe all this low code stuff is going to force the issue finally.
Yeah, potentially. If you go back to what CD was trying, I always start with the problem I'm solving, or the business problem I'm solving. And what CD solves for us is sometimes not what every business needs or every team needs. So that ability that every commit, every change is, automatically getting through to production, that may not be desirable for some folks. So what we practice here at GearSet, on our internal product, we're a SaaS product. We ship 3-4 times a day to all of our customers globally. And what we do is we practice, it's not true CD to that definition where everything's automatically getting to production, but at any moment we can decide that it goes to production, and we decide that 3-4 times a day. It just gives us that little bit more control to decide, hey, this is ready to go out now. We understand this change is going to, change a workflow for some users. So we're going to hold off and do that until the docs and things are ready. So I think that CD side is definitely a good aspiration to head towards, and having it so that you can deploy at any moment is definitely a good place to get yourself to. But the true CD of everything is automatically moved to production through a pipeline. Maybe I'm just not a true believer on that one just yet.
Mm. Do you think that there will be a little more focus on protecting the supply chain, everything from securing it to data protection, and I guess pipelines go down? So are people going to be focused more on that as they build out these low-code platforms?
I think so, for sure. I think low-code's potentially a slightly different mix of problems for supply chain attacks in particular. If you think about a Java project pulling something from Maven or Node pulling from NPM, you just have a massive diversity of open source third-party code, often unvetted, which is where great products like Sneak come in to try and protect that. And Salesforce and a lot of low code, because it is low code, there's less code. You don't have a lot of the same the same reliance just on so many fundamental third-party libraries, because Salesforce in the case of Salesforce in our world, Salesforce provides a lot of that, a lot of the foundational libraries that you might use, like Express or something on Node. Salesforce obviously provide those types of primitives. So there's a little bit less third-party code generally, helps a little bit. But I think you still have a lot of the same risks around data protection, around making sure you've got a really great backup strategy, around static code analysis, making sure that your developers, whilst they may not be so at risk of a supply chain attack, they are still at risk of SQL injection and all of the things that are in the OWASP top 10. So I think data security is just increasingly front of mind for everybody, and high profile events like SolarWinds just really bring it to the fore. So I think low code teams, we already see them adopting things like backup, things like static code analysis, making sure you've got cleanliness across your pipeline. All of that sort of stuff is coming in, and I think we'll continue to do so.
So what's your best advice to folks as they kind of look at this whole low code environment that's starting to emerge? And DevOps is starting to converge with that. What do you see as the biggest challenges? What do you wish people knew before they leapt?
I think my advice for anyone adopting DevOps for low code would be the same as anyone adopting it for any platform. It's understanding, unique to your team, what are the challenges that you have? What are the objectives that you're trying to move towards? And then, applying the agile mindset to it. How do we take these things down piece by piece by piece? Have a nice destination that you're moving towards, but don't let yourself become prisoner. Don't try and achieve all of that immediately. And don't think that, you're at some point you're pre-DevOps and post-DevOps, or you don't have a DevOps process, you do have a DevOps process. It's all about incremental change. I think that's the thing we really talk about with our customers. And it goes back to your CI/CD point. We often have customers come to us and say, hey, we want to implement CD. And we're like, if you don't have source control yet, you might want to, really understand what's in how do you build software today? What are the challenges that you have as you build software and get it out to your users, and start to tackle them one by one. So I think that advice is universal if you're applying DevOps to software engineering team of 2,000 or a low code team of 10 or 15. You want to start incrementally and don't be fooled by some nirvana, some panacea that's over there. Just what's unique to your situation and start to tackle it.
All right, folks, you heard it here first. First of all, don't compare yourself to others. You're just not going to like the answer anyway. And DevOps is kind of like water. It finds its own level. And as long as you're moving forward, it's all good. Hey, Kevin, thanks for being on the show.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
All right, back to you guys in the studio.
SecurityBoulevard.com is the leading resource for news, analysis, and education on challenges facing the cybersecurity industry. SecurityBoulevard.com covers all aspects of cybersecurity, including data security, DevSecOps, cloud security, application security, network security, security threats, and more. SecurityBoulevard.com has the largest selection of security content, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.securityboulevard.com to learn more. SecurityBoulevard.com, home of Security Bloggers Network.
All right, everybody, that wraps up another Techstrong TV broadcast. Hope you enjoyed today's show as much as I did. And we are going to have another great one on Thursday, so I hope you can join me then. Lots of great conversations on tap for that show as well. Until then, I hope everybody has a great day. And please, whatever you do, stay safe.